Little fella by the name of Warpug from the Free World League, loud and very ugly, living his best pug life. Had him dreaming of being a much warrior pilot, sitting on his grandma's lap and he's fighting composed. The boy was shy away from nothing. That's a jag. Warpug pointed at it. I don't think it's a cat. I think this person might be my dad. That's the battle master. Oh no, excuse me, my hand slipped and destroyed it by accident. Warpug destroyed me again. Warpug destroyed another lance. Like he said he would know, he didn't even apologize. Warpug did it to you. Are you little Warpug? Not like the kindest guy. Unsportsmanlike, shoot your legs and Warpug die. An eye for an eye, a man 5'9" and a hateful rise. Shooting DCK players like they shot Cujo. Little pug dog with a burgundy coat. Warpug destroyed me again. Warpug destroyed me again. Warpug did it to you. Warpug destroyed another lance, like he said he would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. He would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. Like you say he would, and then laughed in your face at the beginning. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again. Like he said he would. No, he didn't even apologize. Warpug did it to you, and laughed in your face again.
Warpugs, what's up? Hey guys, what's going on? It is BattleTech Tuesday. It is time for us to learn a little bit more about the timeline. And I decided to put a little bit early, just a little bit early because, well, I got a lot of stuff going on right now. And I'm trying to get some stuff done so I can get some sleep tonight. It's quite a bit. Warpugs, we started this off with individual things like, you know, just every once in a while getting into some stuff, and then all of a sudden just like the amount of want for BattleTech just kind of flooded in, and it just became a thing where I was just like, you know, fine, we will do this once a week. Once a week we will do this. I don't know if Teneville is going to get mentioned, Growlwolf. I really don't know yet, but we're about to find out. Guys, this is from Sven van der Plank, and this is the complete 500-year history of the Age of War. Now, I am just, yeah, I know I'll never catch up Edge Crush, but that's the fun part about it, because there's always more stuff to find. There's always more stuff to find. There's always more stuff to enjoy. There's always more stuff to sit there and learn about. At the same time, I am going to be soon re-jumping back into the lore realm for myself. I have a script on the way. It is about done. I'm taking a short respite from the Officio Assassinorum. The Calidus video is getting worked on, but yes, X and Chattanooga Riley for old time's sake, because why not? Guys, it's time to jump into this. All links for Sven van der Plank are in the description down below. Let's jump right in. The Terran Alliance, the Exodus, and the Outer Reach Rebellion is the first part of this, but this covers the entire Age of War. Thank you guys for joining me for this. This was literally one of the best decisions I've made. I love the fact that so many people are interested in BattleTech. It makes everything so cool. Let's get into it. Warpugs, thank you for joining me. Let's get right in. Ah, yes.
The origin of man's journey into space dates back 1,000 years to the early 21st century. Two significant world events happened almost concurrently that would have ramifications extending far into the future. On the political side of things, the assassination of Soviet Premier Tikhonov in 2011 ushered in the collapse of the Soviet Union and began a civil war that would consume the nation. When the war spilled over into West Germany, NATO forces moved into Russia to secure their nuclear arsenal, while the more Western-friendly liberal faction came out on top in the fighting. In the aftermath, the victorious powers unified to create the Western Alliance. A second major war was narrowly averted when the Asian co-prosperity sphere attempted a naval blockade around Japan. The situation was successfully
hands off the waifus!
De-escalated after only a single violent clash, and soon the major Asian powers were accepted into the Western Alliance as associate members. By 2086, the Western Alliance has established enough of a power base to declare itself the first world government, rebranding as the Terran Alliance. An equally significant scientific achievement occurred around the same time when a team of scientists led by Doctors Kearney and Kurita were able to create a working fusion reactor. This technology was quickly shared among the Western Alliance. During their study, the two scientists made a shocking discovery. Under certain conditions involving
Bedlam, son, I don't apologize for revisiting Zilla, but I still say the image of him getting one shot by Godzilla, that made the pain worth it.
Extraordinary amounts of energy, the rules of Einsteinian physics did not behave as they should have. Theoretically, it could be possible for an object to pass the speed of light. Their announcement was met with such derision from the scientific community that their contributions to the fusion reactor development were ignored and their academic careers ruined. Sadly, neither would live to see the fruits of their pioneering efforts. In the early 22nd century, the advancement of fusion power was such that it was now possible to test their hypothesis. This program, dubbed the Deimos Project, would culminate in 2108 with the departure of the TAS Pathfinder, which successfully jumped from the Sol system to Tau Ceti. Humanity had taken its next giant leap.
Yep.
By 2116, the Terran Alliance had established the first extrasolar colony at New Earth in the Tau Ceti system. This began the period we now know as the First Exodus. The astronomical costs involved in jump ship production meant that they were exclusively the property of the Terran Alliance at first, but gradually this was opened up to corporate and private interests, and even religious ventures. By 2140, humanity had colonized numerous worlds within a 35 light-year radius. The number of viable planets for settling came as a welcome surprise, though true garden worlds remained rare. In the late 22nd century, a series of grand surveys were undertaken to chart humanity's expansion, with the final count in 2235 standing at over 600 worlds within a 120 light-years of Earth. There was, however, another purpose to the grand surveys. Nominally, all new colonies were under the control of a Terran Alliance appointed governor, but as humanity continued to expand, the distances involved began to cause problems. With planets dozens of light years apart, no conventional means of sending messages was possible without literally years of delays. The colonists fell back on a courier system where the ships themselves would carry the messages and then beam them to the planets upon arrival in the target system.
This in and of itself just shows how distance can really cause massive issues when it comes to humanity's forays into the unknown. That is, like, even with a transmission to Mars, even with that, it's going to eventually take, even at the shortest distance between the two planets, it's going to take around 20 minutes for those signals to get back and forth. Even with that 20-minute window, you're talking a lot of things that can happen. 20 minutes in a time of crisis is an eternity.
This still had its issues. Though the jump ships travelled instantaneously, they required weeks to recharge. Coupled with a maximum range of only a couple dozen light years, the more distant colonies found themselves increasingly removed from Terra, and as new generations grew up without even seeing the mother planet, they became somewhat resentful of Terran rule. The Grand Surveys were themselves a warning to the colonies, that no matter how far you travelled, you were still within reach of the Terran Alliance. This was a state of affairs that couldn't last, and in 2235, the first of the colonies declared their independence.
Hooray!
It would take 8 months for the word of their rebellion to reach Earth. The Outer Reaches Rebellion, as the ensuing conflict would become known, did not go the way either side anticipated.
Hey, Avalon.
The superior technology and training of the Terran Alliance had made them confident of an easy victory. The rebels hoped that at the end of a long and bloody conflict, they would come out as the victors of a war of attrition. What happened instead was a series of botched initial assaults that immediately revealed the Alliance to be nothing more than a paper tiger. The cost of mounting an invasion across such vast distances was astronomical, and growing political unrest erupted on Earth. When demands went out for already struggling loyal colonies to increase the amount of goods and personnel they were contributing to the war, the number of secessionist planets increased rapidly. After little more than a year, the expansionist government was ousted from power and replaced by a liberal, Terran-focused government that wanted little to do with the distant colonies. In 2242, this new body issued the Demarcation Declaration. All colonies beyond the range of a single jump were now independent, whether they had the means to provide for themselves or not. The fallout.
That is kind of dickish, though. That is that is absolutely dickish.
From this was catastrophic for the colonies. Few had reached a point of self-sufficiency, and the majority of the jump ships had been owned by the Terran Alliance. Where it was no longer possible to remain, what colonists could quickly moved off-world, and many planets were abandoned. Worse, some populations were left to die without sufficient quantities of fresh food and water. When word of these disasters got back to Earth, the Liberal government lost its majority. So began a cycle of revolving door politics that lasted for 70 years between the two major factions of the Terran Alliance. During this time, new nations were springing up, but the Alliance was solely focused inwards. Both sides moved to secure power, growing their paramilitary forces. Violent clashes became increasingly common, and this political unrest on Earth kicked off the Second Exodus. Freethinkers and scientists rushed to escape the oppressive, stagnant alliance and join the fledgling powers now recolonizing space. The spark that ignited the fire was the death of the leader to a new political party that both sides had been courting. Liberals and expansionists blamed each other, and open war followed.
Of course.
With chaos reigning on Earth and the conflict spreading to other planets within the Alliance, drastic action was needed. The Alliance Global Militia, which had distinguished itself so poorly during the Outer Reaches Rebellion, remained
Distinguished itself so poorly? I think that's a contradiction.
neutral. Over the last half a century, the AGM had seen major restructuring, the lessons having been learned from their prior embarrassment. Now, the Global Militia was a trained force to be reckoned with. The Alliance Navy, with Fleet Admiral James McKenna at its helm, now boasted a fleet of jump-capable warships that surpassed any other in existence. The initial inaction on the part of the AGM has seen smaller units break off to join one side or the other in the Civil War, but McKenna was not prepared to see his military disintegrate. Attention all AGM members currently participating in the barbarities. Cease all hostile actions and return to your barracks, or I will bombard you into oblivion.
Yay!
This was the message McKenna's fleet beamed at Earth upon arriving in orbit.
So this was where the last thing that he went through left off with us last week.
He quickly followed this up with a show of force, using his fleet to demonstrate his global reach by erasing two islands, one in Scotland and the other Australia, from existence. A brief campaign to hunt down and arrest those political leaders who did not surrender brought the Civil War to an end. Feeling a great shame for what had become of the once promising alliance, McKenna declared the old order abolished. The great democratic experiment had failed, and in its place, something new was needed. In 2315, the autocratic Terran hegemony was founded.
Oh boy!
With Director General James McKenna at its head.
The first interstellar nations, lovely.
In 2242, when the Terran Alliance issued their Demarcation Declaration, the colonies found themselves in an untenable position. Only a tiny fraction had achieved self-sufficiency, the others relying on trade to get by, particularly imports of clean drinking water. In this hostile climate, herd instinct kicked in, and the various planets started to cluster together into micro-alliances, proto-nations, and trading leagues. It was a time of rapid change and forced evolution for the colonies. During the remaining 75 years of the Alliance, over 24 new interstellar nations would arise. Among them, we can see the foundations of what would go on to form the 5 successor states in present-day 3025.
Oh, okay.
It would be a mistake, however.
This is what I was wanting to see. This is actually what I wanted to know. Where did all of this come from? Where did the Capellans come from? The Steiners? All of them.
To think that the rebellion marked the first appearance of these new states. Certain of them existed even prior to this in a limited or unofficial capacity. The earliest of all was a historical anomaly, dating from the first Exodus and existing beyond the borders of known space. The Muskegon Empire has the dubious distinction of starting the trend. In 2163, a jump ship bound for neighbouring McHenry malfunctioned, stranding the colonists on uncharted Muskegon. This world was borderline inhospitable, and with no means to return or to contact the Alliance, the ship's crew took drastic action to ensure survival. Personal freedoms were suspended, and all available energy and manpower was poured into establishing a fragile existence. By 2177, repairs to the jump ship had been completed, but by this point a social hierarchy had developed between the original crew and the colonists on board. The former now lorded it over the rest and had little desire to return to the Alliance and see their power surrendered. Instead, they travelled to nearby Emerson and Baton Katos, establishing new colonies using slave labour in the form of criminals and the colonist-class citizens.
Of course!
4 more worlds would be added to the fledgling empire by 2190, and by the time their existence became well known, the Terran Alliance was on the decline, and the Muskegon Empire would become one of the dominant players in that region of space. But this dictatorship was not typical of early expansion. The scarcity of jump ships in the early days caused many corporations and conglomerates to form trading alliances to better pool resources. One of the earliest of these was the Chesterton Trading League of 2193, and later the Tamar Pact of 2235. Though initially these alliances had little interest in
I love how just much lore there is in this to discover all the time.
World governance, post-rebellion, many of the 24 major trade groups would transition in this way. The Capellan Zone, as the region of space that birthed the Capellan Confederation was known, was the most turbulent and active during this early period.
Okay.
Dozens of worlds were already forming alliances, and several planets would become key players in the conflicts that would arise over the next 200 years. Initially, these were one-world republics, such as the dictatorial Sana Supremacy in 2176, the Tikhonov Union in 77, the Liao Republic in 89, and the Capellan Holdfast in 93. The Capellans and Sarns quickly came to blows when explorers from the Supremacy stumbled upon the unknown colony and tried to claim ownership. The Terran Alliance was still strong enough to prevent any aggressive colonial actions within its borders, so the Capellans were able to defend themselves against the now multi-world Supremacy, and re-entered the political scene in 2194 as the Capellan Republic. The Capellans would play a key part in the first Exodus, when in 2218 they established the Capellan Library on the planet Geifer, a massive repository of information freely available to neighbouring worlds, which in turn drew many of Earth's greatest scientists into this region of space. Sensing future trouble with the Supremacy, they formed the Capellan Co-Prosperity Sphere in 2220.
The Capellan how come anything I hear with Co-Prosperity Sphere always just is dickish in the extreme? Just a question.
From the expansionist actions of the Sarns. 5 years later, the attack came, but the Capellan militia were able to rebuff the invaders, and when reinforcements arrived from off-world, the Supremacy forces withdrew. It is perhaps telling that all this was going on right under the noses of the Terran Alliance without their knowledge, as just a decade later, the Outer Reaches Rebellion would ignite. 3 case studies could be made of the planets from which future dynasties would spawn during this period: Marek, Liao, and New Avalon, home to House Davion.
Okay.
During the Outer Reaches Rebellion, Marek remained staunchly neutral until the 11th hour when they threw in their lot with the rebels, declaring their independence in 2238, 1 year after Terra had already withdrawn its forces. By 2241, the Republic of Marek was fully formed and now counted 4 worlds under their control. In New Avalon, their loyalty to the Alliance was pushed past its breaking point when ever-increasing demands for crop yields created a situation where thousands risked starvation. In 2237, the Grain Rebellions would see the AGM Colonial Marines pushed off-world and a new democracy established. Lastly, and perhaps most ominously, the Terran ambassador dispatched to treat with Victor Liao would find himself returning to Earth without the levies he had been sent for, and also without a head. Like the New Avalonians, the Liao Republic geared up for the inevitable retribution, but it never came. The Alliance was done with space, and in 2242, formally withdrew its borders.
There we go.
An explosion of new interstellar players occurred during the mid-23rd century. The Federation of Orient in 2241, Nanking Collective in 42, Tikhonov Grand Union in 43, which incorporated the Chesterton Wells as a province, St. Ives Mercantile Association in 45, Dominion of
The St. Ives Mercantile...
Regulus in 47, and the Cyan Supremacy in 2250. In more distant regions of space, the United Hindu Collective formed, as did the Rimworld's Republic in 2250, followed by the Taurian Homeworlds in 53. By far the quickest off the mark, however, was the Republic of Marek. Not content with a handful of worlds that had agreed to an alliance at the outset, Marek military forces began a campaign that would see them grow the realm to 20 planets in only 5 years. After the conquest of Aries, the Republic rebranded as the Marek Commonwealth in 2246. This made them the preeminent power of the day. What House Marek was achieving through conquest, House Allison of Orient achieved through diplomacy, likely playing off fears of Marek Commonwealth expansionism. By 2271, they had grown to rival their neighbours. The relationship between the two burgeoning powers was cool, though not hostile. Meanwhile, New Avalon's shining attempt at democratic government had collapsed. Though this had been one of the planets better prepared for independence, there was still much that needed doing, and their system of yearly elections...
Avalon, your degeneracy is reaching in not only to the far future, it is reaching to the end of time.
...was so slow and focused on the short term that the people were suffering. A bloody civil war soon erupted among the powerful estates that would see a new order ushered in, and the gradual rise of House Davion. The new government was a swing to the opposite extreme, with officials serving for life, but in the aftermath of war, stability was what was desired most. It's worth noting that not all of the newly independent worlds saw the rise of these new states as a positive thing. Many believed that self-governance was the best way for any planet to function, and this held true throughout most of the Inner Sphere. This was certainly true for the Crucis Reach, where New Avalon was situated. Coreward of Earth, trading clans such as the Tamar Pact, which would eventually transition into a government, Sky Freighting Goods, and the Yazawa Mercantile Association held sway.
Oh my god!
This region wouldn't see interplanetary unification for half a century. In the more volatile Rimwood regions, new collections of planets continued to form. The Stuart Confederacy, formed in 2259, brought another dictatorship into the political sphere, and this was followed by the isolationist Razelhog Concordium in 2260.
Razelhog, okay.
The zone were restructuring to form the Chisholm Protectorate in 65, the Cyan Commonwealth in 67, and more notably the Capellan Hegemony in 2270. By far the most significant development in Inner Sphere politics occurred the following year. By now, House Salage of Regulus had a trade realm to rival the Mareks and Allisons. Each counted among the most prosperous and most powerful nations in existence. But thanks to the efforts of statesman George Humphreys, war between the powers was never on the cards.
Okay.
After several years of intense negotiations, the three houses signed the Articles of Unification, better known as the Treaty of Marek, and unified to create a new superpower, the Free Worlds League. Though the term wouldn't be in use for another 500 years, the first of the successor states had been born.
Okay.
The founding of the Free Worlds League in 2271 into the first true interstellar superpower was arguably the most significant event of the 23rd century, but around them the chaotic and erratic birth of new nations was continuing as normal. Their Spinwood neighbours, the Capellan Hegemony, themselves founded only 1 year prior, were about to enter a period of growth that would in later years be referred to as the Capellan Renaissance. This was chiefly a cultural evolution.
It's amazing they didn't stab themselves in the back while they were doing it.
That would lay the groundwork for the later Capellan state, as the hegemony began to make tentative alliances with other emerging powers in the region. However, the hegemony was an expansionist nation at heart, and they first set their sights on their immediate neighbours in the
Avalon, do you why?
Ingersoll Concordium. A brief campaign in 2272 saw them annex this microstate in its entirety. Spurred on by this success, they next moved against the St. Ives Association the following year, further expanding their empire. By the end of the century, they had established new provinces across the region, but in so doing had created problems for themselves.
Yeah?
The Capellan Hegemony was a scattershot of different planetary groups on an Inner Sphere map. The different provinces were accessible only by traversing other nations, which were at times hostile to them. Defending.
So in other words, they had nothing but border gore. That's all that. Yeah. border gore. This is an EU4 map after 50 years.
This region for the predations of others both within and without the Capellan zone became an ever more challenging task. Meanwhile, the Free Worlds League was making territorial gains of its own. In the Articles of Unification, it was outlined that each of the 3 provinces would be responsible for a particular aspect of government. Orient would handle diplomacy, Regulus would manage trade, and the Commonwealth would be responsible for defence. During times of war, a Captain General will be elected to temporarily control all functions of the League to help them through the conflict. The first instance of this was the war with the Stuart Confederacy, and naturally, House Marek was the clear favourite for this position.
Of course.
On September 19th, 2293, the Free Worlds League began a 4-month campaign that would see them annihilate the Stuart dictatorship and absorb its worlds as a 4th province. House Stuart would survive to the present day, its war long forgotten, and now acting as a staunch supporter for House Marek.
All's well that ends well.
In the Innisphere, the independent worlds were at last beginning to form their own interplanetary states. This began with the merger of several sky-based trading conglomerates in 2296 to form the Sky Traders under the control of Ian McKeeston. Such was the power of this new group that they were able to claim de facto governorship of a group of planets near the Terran Alliance. Over the next 3 years they would transition from Trading League to Interstellar Nation, and so was born the Federation of Sky in 2299. To conclude the development of the 23rd century, the Marlat Association was formed in 2278 and the Principality of Rasalhague was reformed in 2299 from the old Rasalhague Consortium. To kick things off in the new century, after splitting from the Sky Traders, Seth Marsden established Donegal Freights in 2301 on that selfsame planet.
So interspace... So space truckers are the ones that founded these countries, these nations. I love it.
In due course, his trading empire would become the final of the 3 powers in that region of space. On the other side of the Innisphere, on distant New Samarkand, one family was bringing the previously opposed city-states together into a unified world government. Emerging on the scene as the Lord of Yamashiro, Shiro and his brother Urizen were about to establish a dynasty that would survive the next 700 years of turmoil into the present day. Raised in a family with deeply traditional and martial values, the 2 brothers would go on to proudly wave the banner of House Kurita. The Kuritans had dreams of founding a militaristic superstate and began working towards this goal by reaching out to nearby Galadon, the major power in that region of space. Though Galadon was a successful colony, they played second fiddle to the Ozawa Mercantile Association. This massive organisation dominated the entire quarter and had grown fabulously wealthy, often at the expense of the individual worlds they did business with. The planets, including both Galadon and New Samarkand, had grown dependent on the OMA, but also chafed under their influence. When Shiro Kurita arrived on Galadon in 2302, he cast the Ozawas as their common enemy and proposed an alliance to help them free themselves from the control of this powerful trading family. Using well-placed flattery, Shiro suggested this new partnership would take the name the Alliance of Galadon, and proposed that he would take command of a new military force to wrest control of their planets from the OMA. With the agreement in hand, he turned to other nearby planets, approaching the governments of Dnepropetrovsk and Sverdlovsk, the former willingly adding their strength to the alliance. A hastily armed fleet of ships began to board and impound any Ozawa vessels that entered the region, with each captured jumpship adding to their navy. The stolen goods were in turn used to grow the size of their military, in anticipation of coming events.
Yay!
When the OMA realised what was happening, they began first by boycotting the worlds, but then switched to a public relations campaign that saw Kurita start to lose its grasp. Shiro was not prepared to fail now though, and in a move that shocked everyone, resulted to the terrorist bombing of all Ozawa Mercantile Association facilities on the planet Galadon within a single day. There was little to no fallout from this, however, as over the last year he had cunningly replaced his opposition within the Galadon government, after unearthing, or perhaps fabricating, evidence of double dealing with the Ozawas.
Of course.
Replacing them in turn with loyal supporters. The Ozawas were done, and though the organisation would survive for a time, they were forced to pay tribute to House Kurita. Not prepared to rest on their laurels, the brothers' next move was to launch what was at the time the largest planetary invasion in history. In 2303, 50,000 Alliance troops descended on Sverdlovsk in a show of force that utterly crushed local resistance. But the actions of the Kurita brothers were about to become an afterthought in the histories of the time. Smouldering tension in the Capellan Zone was about to see the 2 dominant powers clash violently. This conflict would spill over into not only the other powers of the zone, but involve even the Free Worlds League and the forces of House Davion.
Lovely!
In 2305, the Capellan hegemony finished drafting their plans for what they thought would be a preemptive strike against the Sana supremacy. Their best estimates suggested a 4-week campaign would bring the Sans to heel and deal with their hostile neighbour for good. The Hegemony Supremacy War holds the dubious honour of becoming the first true interstellar war, their presumed easy victory lasting not for 4 weeks, but for 4 years.
Oh boy.
The origins of the war lay with the secession of Palos and Wei from the Sana supremacy at the beginning of the year. Capella decided to support the independence of these two planets and offered to help defend them when Sana came to reconquer their worlds. In February, the Hegemony launched their doomed raid against Sana and immediately bogged down when they met near fanatical resistance from the Sana militia. Reserves from all across the supremacy were recalled to the capital, and this stalemate would continue through to September when the Capellans withdrew. Meanwhile, the Sans were able to retake Palos, establishing themselves as an early favourite. Things got worse in October of 2305 when the geographical dispersion of the hegemony came back to haunt them.
Right.
A sharp uptick in pirate action, clandestinely hired by Sana, saw the hegemony worlds of Redfield, Daniels, Lee, Ball and Highspire all come under attack, which in turn drew military forces away from the front lines. These raids continued until reinforcements came from the neighbouring states of the Chesterton and St. Ives trading leagues. The Colonial pirates launched an operation against Osha, but were caught recharging
Launched a campaign against Osha.
in the Alcyon system, where they were destroyed almost entirely in April of 2306. There was more positive news when Capellan troops were able to successfully defend Wei from the Supremacy forces, but troubling information soon came to light when it was discovered that the Cluanian pirates had been in league not just with the Sans, but the Davions too, perhaps in an attempt to further destabilise the region and expand their own influence. Seeking to forge further alliances of their own, the Hegemony approached the Free Worlds League, and in May promptly signed the Ryerson Conventions. The League offered up fresh troops for the campaign, but these were soon found to be green and inexperienced. Meanwhile, the Captain General, Danak Salaj, began his own assault, taking control of Berenson and Wassat. The Hegemony was forced to implement oppressive legislation against their own citizens,
of course,
in an effort to maintain their struggling supply line and dwindling military might. This succeeded in part when the Capellans began their final phase of the war in December 2307. By September of
Alright,
the following
Malachi,
year,
you have a nice
they had
night, bud.
succeeded in occupying 17 of the Sana worlds. However, their alliance with the Free Worlds League had cast them as invaders as opposed to liberators of planets under the thumb of the Supremacy dictatorship. Though the Capellans had been able to win the support of the semi-independent Chesterton League, the Tikhonov Grand Union remained officially neutral. This was a stance encouraged by generous donations on the part of Sana towards certain influential figures within the Union. Tikhonov
Cause you gotta have bribes.
had its own problems during this period. For the past 4 years they'd been in conflict with the Marlet Association and lost several key worlds. In November 2308 they began their counterattack against the Marlets. Their initial moves met with great success, and by the end of the year they had retaken 2 of the lost Chesterton worlds.
Huh.
Meanwhile, the draconian measures undertaken by the Hegemony government were about to catch up to them when in the final month of 2308 the planet Arboris declared their independence. If the Capellans allowed this to go unanswered, it would set a dangerous precedent given how unpopular the current regime had become.
Yay.
The 2nd Andurien Reserve Fleet was promptly mobilised and moved from Zion to Arboris. En route to the planet, however, they came upon unexpected opposition in the form of the Liao Merchant Fleet. Arboris had been accepted as a protectorate state of the previously independent Liao. In the ensuing fleet action, the Capellans took significant damage from the technologically inferior Liao ships.
Of course.
By battle's end, were in a state only to maintain a blockade around the planet Liao, abandoning the assault against Arboris. By early 2309, the Tikhonov invasion of the Marlet Association was continuing at pace, but the unexpected death of the general behind the campaign saw it fizzle out after less than a year. This was followed by the death of one of the ruling tetrarchs of the Tikhonov Grand Union, which in turn threw the nation into disarray. On the other side of the Sana supremacy, the writing was on the wall for the Capellan hegemony and the ruling Aries family. The Free Worlds League had withdrawn from their alliance, and anti-government protests grew larger and more frequent. Their final victory came at Sakhalin in April of 2309. But soon after, the Liao blockade was lifted, and in the following month, an armistice was reached. The Tikhonov Grand Union came forward as a neutral arbiter, and by December the two sides agreed to peace. The end came on the final day of the year when Prime Magnate of the Hegemony, Paula Aris, took her own life. In the aftermath of the Hegemony Supremacy War, there was new impetus among the nations of the Capellan Zone to unify in the face of threats without. In 2310, the hegemony was disbanded as a part of the peace agreement and replaced with a compelling commonality. Sick of internal strife, the major powers unified behind this banner, though each would retain internal control of their own nations. Across the sphere, Kurita was beginning the next phase of his expansion plan. By now, the Alliance of Galadon laid claim to more than a dozen worlds and had a fearsome reputation. Several neighbouring planets were also beginning to establish themselves as interstellar players around this point. Shiro began a diplomatic voyage that would see him visit many of these worlds, offering them membership in the Alliance, promising to support them in their own territorial disputes and ambitions.
Well, Seth, good times rhymes with war crimes, you know?
Shiro was able to win the favour of all of his targeted planets. Some even joined because of his impressive military record. By the time Shiro returned to New Samarkand, the size of his realm had exploded to include around 30 planets.
Oh, damn.
Unlike the other nations that were centralised around a single major world, the Alliance of Galadon was a tenuous chain of widely dispersed planets that stretched far towards the periphery. With no immediate rivals in the area, however, they were safe from attack for the time being. In early 2311 though, it became apparent to the newly joined members that Shiro would play them against each other when Davion and Altair both threatened each other with Galadon's support. In response, the two worlds split from the Alliance and formed the Davion Federation. Other planets followed suit, declaring their intention to leave the Union. In response, Shiro launched a major political purge that saw roughly half of all the planetary leaders, nobles and diplomats within the Alliance of Galadon lose their lives.
Is anybody surprised by this? I just need to take a quick... Hold on a second. We're going to do this right. We're going to do this right if we're going to do it at all. Hold on a second. Because, yeah. This is... Hold on a second. There we go. Let's just start that off. Okay, there we go. You guys answer honestly, okay?
He then unleashed his brother Urizen to bring the errant worlds back in line. Benjamin would fall in late 2311, then Telos and Asgard the following year. The final days of the Terran Alliance were at hand by this point, the last of the minor nations to appear around them were the Protectorate of Donegal in 2313, which grew out of Marston's Donegal Freights, and the Duchy of Liao in 2315, having established a strong reputation for itself during the Hegemony Supremacy War. That same year also saw the final collapse of the Terran Alliance and its rebirth as the Terran Hegemony.
Okay.
In 75 years, the political situation had evolved to become unrecognizable to how things had been before the Outer Worlds Rebellion. Humanity was now at its most disunited with 24 different alliances in existence. The most powerful of these was the Free Worlds League, but Director General James McKenna had grand plans for the new Terran hegemony.
Okay.
His position was that the formerly independent worlds were nothing but an errant flock to be brought back into the fold. The 25th century would see him act on these plans, which triggered a chain reaction in the politics of the neighbouring regions. By the end of the century, less than half of the 24 interstellar nations that were around to see the birth of the hegemony would remain.
'Cause you gotta have goals, you know? There's nothing like a little bit of fun. And carnage. That is just how things go. Yep, nobody's surprised. There we go. Okay, good stuff. The Campaigns of Persuasion. That's a hell of a name. So far we've seen Merrick established, we've seen Kurita established, and Lao is somewhere. Okay, Lao is on Lao. I mean, yeah, here we go.
When James McKenna was elected Director General at the beginning of 2316, he soon made it known that his ambition was to see all of humanity reunited under the auspices of the Terran hegemony. His first
Harrison Dodge
action was to ensure the existing member planets of the old alliance transitioned to the new hegemony, which he achieved in short order, only on a couple of occasions having to resort to the threat of violence. Not all of his immediate neighbours were keen to join, however. Many had learned to get by just fine in the 75 years that had passed since the Demarcation Declaration. Sensing the way the winds were blowing, the worlds of Aries, Quinton and Helen entered into a mutual protection pact in an effort to dissuade the Terran hegemony from moving in their direction. McKenna was unimpressed, and in March launched his first crusade that would see him utterly crush
Crusades
on these worlds and absorb them into the hegemony. The short-lived Davion Federation was incorporated more peacefully. By the end of 2317, several more planets had been added. Though the cost had been unexpectedly high, the Director General began formulating plans for a second wave. Around them, the independent worlds began to worry. Suddenly, many of the interplanetary squabbles and rivalries that had occupied them over the last few decades were shown to be irrelevant in the face of the outwards expanding hegemony. The change in fortunes for those on Terra became a unifying force for other governments across the inner sphere. In the Crucis Reach, Lucian Davion embarked on a voyage that would see him meet the leaders of several surrounding worlds. Inviting each of them to join him at a conference on Davion, there the governments met to hammer out the details of a new alliance and together sign the Crucis Pact. 20 of those present would sign, though notably Muskegon and Marlette were 2 of the 3 that politely declined and left without doing so. In 2317, the Federated Suns was born,
There we go.
with Lucian Davion at its head. 1 year later, in 2318, the Muskegon Empire had a change of heart and willingly joined the Federated Suns. However, dissent among the worker class of this dictatorship increased as they were made aware yet again of how little control they had over their lives.
Of course.
Several decades of trade between the worlds of Baton Katos and Emerson with the neighbouring Chesterton League have resulted in the formation of strong ties with that body. They now declare their independence from the Muskegon Empire, and by extension the Federated Suns, and immediately join the much smaller Chesterton Alliance. Lucian Davion, who was one of the most skilled diplomats of his day, now flexed his military muscles and called on the planets of the Federated Suns to raise an army with which to take back these worlds.
Yay!
Their subsequent invasion couldn't have gone much worse, and resulted in a humiliating defeat for the Suns at the hands of the much smaller Chesterton League. In a forward direction, Shiro Kurita was ready to dispense with all pretense and declare the founding of his new dynasty. In December of 2319, the old Alliance of Galadon was officially disbanded and the new Draconis Combine would take its place, with House Kurita
There's the
firmly
first one.
established at its head. In 20...
So we have the Free Worlds League, then the Federated Suns, and now Kurita is here.
320, James McKenna began the next wave of the conquest for the Terran hegemony. By this point, he had established a standard operating procedure for the invasion of worlds. First, a fleet of warships would arrive in system and dispatch any resistance at the jump points. Only after control had been established were the troop transports waiting at a neighbouring star called in. Afterwards, the hegemony armed forces would take complete control of the space immediately above the target world, before finally landing troops on the ground. It was a process that took weeks or even months to pull off, but it significantly reduced casualties. However successful the invasions were, McKenna began to realise that the task of uniting the inner sphere was beyond even his abilities by this point. He toned down his expansionist rhetoric and dispatched ambassadors to what he considered to be the significant interstellar nations. The Free Worlds League and Federated Suns were pleased to welcome these ambassadors and establish new trade deals with the hegemony. The Draconis Combine responded a little more coolly. They had their own ambitions of galactic conquest after all.
Of course.
The two signed a neutrality agreement and agreed to stay out of each other's way. One group that was not invited to the talks was the Capellan Commonalty, a group of loosely affiliated nations within the Capellan Zone. McKenna viewed them as insignificant pretenders and immediately took the side of the Federated Suns, who had recently concluded a deal to peacefully absorb the Marlette Association, and the Free Worlds League in all disputes. He also geared up for further expansion in that direction himself. First to make a move, however, was the Draconis Combine. Next in their sights was the peaceful Principality of Rasalhague. In 2330,
Leave him
they kicked
alone.
off what all anticipated would be a short campaign. Initial progress was good, with Rasalhague constantly caught by surprise. Defenders were anticipating an attack on their capital, but it never came. Instead, they were losing their planets piecemeal. In preparation for their next attack, the Kuritans began to stockpile weapons on New Bergen, which in 2334 was under the joint command of Urizen's 2 oldest sons.
Yeah, sad Viking
Tragedy
noises.
struck the Kurita family when a group of Rasalhagians landed on planet and conducted a surprise raid. Both brothers were killed and the supplies seized. This single counterattack resulted in decades of repercussions for both sides. The Principality now had the means to continue to fight the Draconis Combine almost indefinitely using guerrilla tactics.
Nice.
Urizen too never recovered from the loss of his sons and died a few years later, followed by his brother Shiro in 2348. In 67, Shiro's son Tenno declared the Combine's victory over Rasalhague, but in reality the outcome was a stalemate. Rasalhague managed to keep their independence in the end, at the cost of having the Kurita family installed as governors, and also had to accept the Draconis military units within their borders, forming the basis of what would become the Rasalhague military district. Jumping back to 2332, the Capellans were taking advantage of the weakness of the Federated Suns military and seized a handful of worlds. Seeing the nation he'd worked so hard to build start to fall apart, Lucian Davion retired his presidency and passed away a few months later.
Sad.
His brother Charles took control of the Federated Suns after his retirement and immediately put pressure on the Terran hegemony to begin the next wave of their military conquests. The Capellans were forced to scale back their assaults in 2335 when the hegemony started to move, and by the following year Davion had retaken several of the Lost Worlds. Two of the main targets for the Third Terran campaign were within the borders of the Federation of Sky, though not strictly members of that nation. Initially, the third wave went as planned, but it was during this campaign that McKenna's son Conrad rose to command within the HAF.
I'm always concerned when somebody is named Conrad for some reason. I don't know why.
As they closed in on their final goal in 2338, Conrad increasingly disregarded standard operating procedure during the invasions. A mixture of arrogance and complacency played a part in the catastrophe that followed. As the hegemony fleet appeared in system, they found themselves surrounded by an enormous minefield with dozens of remote activated missiles set off by the ensuing blasts.
Oopsie
Unable to clear
poopsie.
the jump point, the troop transports, which had been commanded to follow immediately behind, materialized right on top of and inside the floundering first wave.
Oof.
Conrad shifted the blame onto his fellow admirals in the aftermath,
Of
and was
course.
soon facing a mutiny when he threatened to execute the senior officers. It was at this point that James McKenna himself unexpectedly arrived, the news having reached him on Earth, and relieved his son of command. What was left of the fleet was ordered back to Earth, and the invasion abandoned. The Director General was the last to leave the system, lingering for 3 hours as he surveyed the carnage. In the ensuing months, McKenna was stepped down as the head of the hegemony, and died later that year. In his place, a distant relative, Michael Cameron, was elected the second Director General. With the ascension of House Cameron, the Inner Sphere would see the birth of another ruling dynasty at the head of a major state. Lastly, the 2330s would also see some major changes in the periphery. By 2335, the newly rechristened Taurian Concordat had expanded significantly, though contact with the outside world was limited to a very small group of traders from the Capellan zone. The biggest fear for the Calderon family was aggression from the Federated Suns, and because of that, they chose to keep their existence hidden. Across the Inner Sphere, the Rimworld's Republic had begun to expand in 2334, and by 38 now had more than a dozen worlds.
Yay!
Eventually, they came into contact with the Tamar Pact, were able to establish friendly relations, the two sides both more concerned about where the Draconis Combine would go next after the Principality of Razalhag fell. It was because of this fear that the Tamars finally acted on something that had been whispered about for some years. Reaching out to the Federation of Sky and the Protectorate of Donegal, they called for an alliance between the three powers to defend from outward aggression. Sky had only recently been threatened by the Terran hegemony, so had added impetus to join these talks. Donegal, Sky and Tamar were in agreement on many things, but struggled somewhat to reach consensus on how their new alliance would function. The compromise they settled on was intended to give each member nation a fair say, but would result in somewhat ineffectual leadership. Nevertheless, on January 5th, 2341, the Terran Alliance officially recognized the founding of the Lyran Commonwealth. All eyes and ambitions were now focused on the Capellan Zone. Lucian's son Reynard Davion took control of the Federated Suns on the 21st of May 2340, after the death of his uncle Charles. Reynard was much more military-minded than the previous generation of Davions, and sought to bring the new might of his nation to bear against the Capellans. During Charles's reign, he had founded the Federated Peacekeeping Forces, a predecessor to the current-day AFFS, and used them to retake some of the worlds that had been lost. Now they had new targets. When the Marlat Association had joined the Federated Suns, they brought with them their rivalry with Tikhonov. Seeking to settle old scores, Reynard began his campaign in 2344, targeting several worlds in the Chesterton province of the Tikhonov Grand Union. The Union was in decline at this point, and after resisting for only a year, in 2345 signed the Almac Accords, handing control of the disputed planets over to the Federated Suns. They then cemented these territorial gains by concluding the Akala Pact with a Capellan commonality, ensuring that they would not support their ally in a counter-invasion. Sensing blood in the water, the always aggressive Sanu Supremacy launched their own invasion of the Tikhonov Grand Union in 2351. By the end of the following year, the Supremacy had taken control of the remaining Chesterton worlds. Both sides petitioned the Capellan commonality to support them in their case for ownership over these planets, and when help was not forthcoming, entered their own candidates into the running for governorship of what was essentially a foreign realm.
Yay!
Continued involvement of foreign powers in the election process eroded the common people's faith in the democratic process, until few believed that the commonality was sustainable. The Federated Suns' invasion of 2357 brought the reality of their situation sharply back into focus. Several worlds were taken, including Chesterton, and as a result of the fiasco, the government collapsed. In its place, a new one formed under the leadership of Seluk Tukas, who was able to assuage the rulers of Sarna and Tikhonov by supporting the former in their recent acquisitions, and promising the latter a renewed campaign to retake the worlds lost to House Davion. Tukas's immediate response was to send forces to the planet Bel, but upon arrival they found the colony completely deserted.
Oh boy.
2363 was the year chosen for the counterattack.
Oh, that's an update and a half right there.
On the Federated Suns. Renouncing the Akala and Almac Accords, the Commonalty went on the offensive, sending 8 crack regiments from Capella, St. Ives and Tikhonov to the planet Lee as the first step of their grand invasion. This was as far as they would go, however, as elements within the Supremacy government had leaked plans to the Federated Suns. Waiting for them on Lee were 10 regiments of Davion's finest. The ensuing bloodbath saw precious few of the Commonalty forces escape. Tukas would not long outlive them, and was assassinated in February 2365. The Aries family, dormant since the Hegemony Supremacy War, saw this moment to retake control of the region, but faced unexpectedly stiff opposition from their rivals in House Liao. At the conference held to discuss the future of the Capellan Zone nations, the mood was grim, as word had just reached the delegates that Reynard Davion had dispatched his fleet to Capella to ensure the validity of the next election.
Okay, so we don't have nearly the level of absolute border gore that we had before. We don't have that nearly as much, but it does look like the Free Worlds League is starting to form up over here. This is just an absolute thundering mess. And the Federated Suns over here, they're looking rather strong, but they're so spread out. This is so spread out.
As the others bickered, Franco Liao made the bold suggestion to disband the Commonalty entirely. In its place would rise the Capellan Confederation, one strong, unified nation under the control of a single central figure.
There we go.
This new nation would be powerful enough to resist Davion aggression, he promised. The alternative was that he would use his extensive merchant navy to blockade all key worlds within the zone. His motion passed with a unanimous but one vote. After officially disbanding the Commonalty, he extended an olive branch to Warren Aris, offering to make him Deputy Chancellor. Aris threw the offer back in his face, so instead, he had him executed. Racing to Capella, Liao evacuated as many and as much as he could before the arrival of the Federated Suns fleet, leaving the system himself only hours before they appeared. The Davions soon moved into the deserted city. The Liao fleet jumped back in behind them. Confident that they would not fire upon their own city and civilians, the Davion commander refused to surrender and made plans to contact New Avalon. Franco never gave him the opportunity. Every weapon available was fired upon Capella Prime, devastating the city, those left behind, and the FBF forces. In the aftermath, the Confederacy capital was moved to Siam, where it remains to this present day. Though most of the nations within the Capellan Zone ratified the foundation of the Confederacy, it was now the turn of the Tikhonovs to act contentiously. The Grand Union would outlive the other states, which were now rebranded as commonalities within the Greater Confederacy.
Right.
The two groups initially maintained an awkward semi-independent neutrality. The nobility of Tikhonov turned to creating private armies to defy laws coming from Siam. Franco decided to make an example of one especially troublesome unit known as Tormasov's Galactic Rangers. He maneuvered his own forces onto their planet and attacked the gang, chasing them off-world. As they fled, they unknowingly entered the Taurian Concordat, where they were shocked to come into contact with what was at the time an unknown nation. As Tormasov discussed an alliance with this new group, the Capellans arrived. In the confusion, the Tikhonov unit was able to steal several Taurian jump ships, and made their next move into Davion space, where they were finally destroyed. Seeking the source of this presumed Capellan raid, Reynard Davion moved rimward and stumbled upon the Concordat himself. Not recognizing them as an independent nation, he attacked. At last, the cover had been blown, and the Taurians were...
You just attacked the Taurians. I see you want to know what it's like to chew 5 gum.
Were forced to fight back. The ensuing short war saw both the Federated Suns and the Taurian Concordat develop a lasting hatred for each other. The conflict only ended with the death of Reynard Davion in 2371. On the opposite side of the sphere, Robert Marsden launched a coup to take complete control of the Lyran Commonwealth. Disgusted by the way the ruling Archons were taking advantage of the economic crisis that was bankrupting millions of citizens, he was finally able to forge the Commonwealth into a functional nation. Tamaran Sky at first resisted, but Marsden dispatched his military forces, loyal from his prior service, to crush them into submission. The looming threat of a Kurita attack kept the realm from flying apart. A period of peace settled on the galaxy in the wake of the hostilities.
Oh, hooray!
Nobody knew it at the time, but this was nothing but a brief respite before the devastating Age of War that would follow. The Age of War.
Age of War introduction. I love that it has to have its own damned introduction.
Was a period of 150 years that saw a near constant state of conflict develop between the various states of the Inner Sphere. It directly followed the unification of the disparate planetary groups during the 24th century and the 25 years of peace that began in the 2370s. During the early years of humanity's expansion into space, though there was the
Yes, Seth, you can always blame the Capellans.
occasional border conflict, this was nothing compared to what would follow. In many ways though, the Age of War conjures images that are largely incongruent with the reality of those years. The fighting that permeated this period in history was an unusual mix, primarily low-level, low-casualty border disputes, not too dissimilar to the Third Succession War, but with occasional bursts of atrocities and unrestrained use of nuclear, chemical and biological weapons.
Yay!
Even still, the death toll from the combined 150 years would be surpassed by the comparatively brief reunification war that would immediately follow it. The idea of civilized warfare was one that first came to fruition during the Age of War, following the explosive Andurien War. This conflict, beginning in 2398, is today viewed as the official commencement of this dark chapter in history. Soon after, the Aries conventions would come into being and have a lasting impact on the way wars were contested. Later, the publication of the Lorix Creed would cement the idea of the warrior as someone noble and worthy of the utmost respect. This period in history would see the last of the great houses make their debut with the rise of House Steiner in the Lyran Commonwealth. It would also see the near extinction of House Kurita in the Draconis Combine, and the complete implosion of House Davion in the Federated Suns.
So this is how all this really kicked off. You have Lyran up here, the Rimworlds, Tarian Concordant. You have this mess that is eventually going to be the Capellans, and Kurita is like in the, oh my god. Okay, now everything kind of makes sense. Now I'm starting to put together. Now I'm starting to put together everything. Okay, that works.
But perhaps the most significant development during the Age of War was a technological one. It was during the mid-25th century that Battlemechs first took to the field, revolutionizing the art of war forever. What followed was a mad scramble as the neighbouring nations employed various methods to get their hands on their own mechs. A study of the Age of War should be encouraged by all acolytes of history, as in many ways the political fallout from this time period is still being felt today in 3025, but doing so comes with its challenges. Many important documents from the period are missing, and charting the continued expansion of the great powers is difficult to accomplish with any degree of accuracy. With only fragmentary records to draw upon, there are unfortunate gaps in our knowledge. The first comprehensive interstellar map dates from the founding of the Star League in 2571, the culmination and conclusion to the entire Age of War. From this we can extrapolate backwards where records allow, but the further back we go, inevitably errors will creep in, particularly as we approach the borders of the periphery about which we know so little. It's quite probable that the outward expansion of nations continued gradually throughout the age, but for the sake of our analyses, we can only display the endpoint throughout. Before delving into the Age of War proper, it would be beneficial to take a brief look at the relative fortunes of the six major powers at the turn of the century.
Okay.
In the Terran hegemony, the role of Director General had passed from McKenna to his relative Michael Cameron. One particularly noteworthy reform introduced during his reign was the introduction of the peer list, a modernised form of nobility. Though these weren't hereditary titles at first, it was an idea that would disseminate across the Inner Sphere, and soon the rest of the neighbouring realms had their own equivalent. This period of time also saw a gradual strengthening of the family's ties to the role of Director General. After Michael, the directorship passed through several eras before coming to rest with his grandson Brian. By the end of the century, the Camerons were so ingrained in the political landscape that even the allegation that he was behind the death of his unpopular brother wasn't enough to stop Brian from ascending to the top step of government. Once in power, he began to construct so-called Castles Brian, a series of expansive fortifications across the border of the Terran hegemony. The Federated Suns had already seen a presidency pass between half a dozen Davions in its short life. For the most part, things were going well, but a looming shadow was hanging over the nation. A problem of succession had developed between the twin sons of the unpopular Etienne Davion and the only child of Etienne's younger brother Paul. Both the brothers had served as president at one point, adding further complexities to the issue. For the time being, the president of the Federated Sons was Etienne and Paul's sister Marie, who hoped to hand the reins to Paul's son once he was old enough.
Okay.
In the Draconis Combine, there was no question that it was the Kurita dynasty that would continue to inherit the role of coordinator. Shiro's son Tenno succeeded him, and afterwards Tenno's son Nihongi. The latter had been an ineffectual ruler and had gradually alienated all of his supporters and family. Before any action was taken to remove him from power, a horse riding accident saw him lose his life.
A horse riding accident. I smell bullshit.
To his militant son Robert. Across the border in the Lyran Commonwealth, the Marsden coup had brought about a dramatic improvement for the fledgling nation. This was not to last, however, as in 2395 a botched assault against Promised Land resulted in the death of the Archon under suspicious circumstances. A military takeover was narrowly avoided with the ascension of Robert's brother, Alistair, a junior officer in the Lyran Armed Forces. The Free Worlds League remained the most democratic of all the major powers, with no single family dominating the political landscape. However, cracks were starting to develop between the powerful houses Marek of Atreus and Salage of Regulus. The newest of all the great powers, the Capellan Confederation, had a score to settle with its neighbours. Franco Liao had not long delayed in strengthening his family's ties to the seat of Chancellor, and his position was inherited by his warmonger son Kerneth.
Yay!
It was he that would ultimately start the Age of War by launching the Andurien campaign.
Did I even, was it even really a question as to who was going to kick this crap off? I mean, was it ever really a question who was going to kick this crap off?
Over the course of the next century and a half, 3 separate major wars would be fought over these worlds. The Capellans would also begin a brutal war of extremes with the Taurian Concordat. The Lyran Commonwealth would suffer a major thrust on each of its borders in the early 25th century, before beginning their infamous Long March campaign in retaliation. The only border that was relatively quiet during this time was between the Draconis Combine and Federated Sons, but that was merely because the two had not yet advanced to the point of close proximity. By the beginning of the 26th century, they too were launching constant probes and raids against each other. But by far the largest and most destructive conflict of the entire age was waged within the borders of a single state. The Davion Civil War was a 4-way battle for supremacy of enormous complexity, as various branches of the family fought for dominance.
The Andurien Wars.
If the average citizen of the 31st century were to go to their local bookstore and purchase an atlas of the Inner Sphere, they'd perhaps notice a conspicuous absence within. One of the most infamous planets in human history, the border world of Andurien, source of so much bloodshed and arguably the progenitor to the wars that have been waging for over half a millennium, is nowhere to be found. It's no grand conspiracy, but merely the result of the collective human consciousness deciding that some things are best forgotten, and to speak of them is to needlessly open old wounds. And so, Andurien continues to be absent in many published works today. The planet itself, first colonised by the Scion Commonwealth in the 23rd century, had been taken by the Free Worlds League in 2369, one of the numerous worlds Franco Liao had willingly traded for time while he struggled to unify his realm into a force strong enough to fight off aggressors. Now though, Kerneth Liao wanted to make a name for himself by retaking those lost worlds, starting with the planets claimed by the Free Worlds League. The attack wasn't unexpected, as Peter Marek had been elected as Captain General of the Free Worlds League a few years earlier in anticipation. The Capellans first descended on the numerous worlds in the Andurien region, but the fighting soon spread along the entire border. Nor was the Free Worlds League the sole target of Kerneth's wrath, as in 2399, Liao forces carried out an orbital bombardment of Novaya Zemlya in the Federated Sons as retaliation for the destruction of Capella Prime. In the first 3 years of the war, things were going against the Free Worlds League, and several worlds including Andurien were lost. The disastrous defense of Kwamashu by Peter Marek in 2401 saw Parliament start to turn against him. This shift was championed by House Salage. Gradually, the power and authority of the Captain Generalcy was eroded, with the intent to reduce the influence of House Marek, the traditional holders of the title. Despite this outside interference, Peter Marek was able to formulate a plan to turn the tide in his favour. He launched a deep strike raid into the heart of the Capellan Confederation, taking aim at their capital, Cyan, as well as Cordiaga and Capella. The goal was to relieve the pressure on his attackers by distracting Kurita's commanders with attacks behind the lines. At first, the Liao forces pressed ahead, taking Algezar and Mosero, but were eventually forced to divert some of their forces to protect their own worlds. The momentum had now swung firmly behind Marek, and soon Liao troops were withdrawing from the planets they had taken.
So the Free World's League is currently stomping on the Capellans, okay.
A peace agreement signed in 2404 sought to resolve the Andurien issue for good by allowing those worlds to vote as to which nation they would belong to after a period of 10 years had passed.
Oh yeah, let's just bomb the living shit out of you, fight on your soil, and then ask you who you would like to call dad. The fuck?
Their eventual choice being to remain with the Free Worlds League. As well as the changes on the border, the Andurien War would bring about the rise of House Graham Marek and the creation of the 6th province in the Free Worlds League, the Duchy of Graham Marek. Even so, the fuse had now been lit and violence continued elsewhere along the border. In time, this would spread to encompass the entire inner sphere. A century would pass before another Mad Liao would set his sights on the Andurien worlds again. This time, it was lust that would bring about the destruction of so many lives. Calvin Liao, Chancellor of the Confederation, had been making repeated advances to the daughter of the Duke of Andurien, hoping that she would join his harem of 24 wives. Rebuffed at every turn, Calvin was eventually spurned into action, and in 2528 launched his offensive. This time, the conflict would engulf the entire Duchy of Andurien, and Liao troops could be found everywhere from Meadowvale to Fujidera. Facing Calvin was Captain General Albert Marek, whose superior military strategy was able to push back repeated Capellan assaults. In his anger, Calvin unleashed nuclear Armageddon on the Andurien worlds, launching the death toll into the millions. Nor was the target of the entire campaign, Lady Massilia Allard, spared from this fate, dying alongside thousands of other innocents in one of the blasts.
She's just not that into you, my guy! What the hell? Dude, he got over her. He nuked her. Dude, what the hell? He got over her, all right.
Only the assassination of Calvin in 2530 allowed for an...
I mean, when he told the girl he'd blow her mind, I'm not sure that's what she was thinking, I'm saying. Yeah, that's the next level Yandere. Yeah, that's no shit.
Opportunity to end the conflict. His successor, Michael Liao, met with Albert on New Delos the following year at a meeting orchestrated by Deborah Cameron of the Terran hegemony. It was agreed that the planets would be returned to the Free Worlds League, and as a restitution, the contested world of Hassad would also be offered in the treaty. And yet even this was not the end of the issue. Just 20 years later, the latest Chancellor, Terence Liao, saw a third Andurien campaign as a way to win support, and so kicked off yet another war in 2551.
Leave it alone! Fuck!
The aging Albert Marek returned to the field again, and by 56 had fought Liao to a standstill, again securing the planets for the Free Worlds League. This time, peace was orchestrated by Deborah Cameron's son, Ian, the new Director General of the hegemony. The Treaty of Geneva settled the issue once and for all, but not in the way many expected. Having successfully won 2 campaigns, there was no doubt that Albert Marek had the strongest hand in the negotiations, but he and Ian Cameron had even greater ambitions. In the final years of the 24th century, Robert Kurita took the reins of power from his deceased father and became the 4th coordinator of the Draconis Combine. Already he had established a brutal reputation for himself, having murdered his sister's peasant lover, Werner von Rose, and so those around him prepared for the worst. Looking on enviously at the fighting going on in the rimward area of the Inner Sphere, Robert Kurita began planning his own offensive against the Lyran Commonwealth. His plan called for a feigned push towards the Lyran capital of Arcturus, along the border between the Federation of Sky and the Tamar Pact, where the defences were weakest. But after the Lyrans moved to defend their capital, the Kuritans would swing to the left and aim to meet a second push coming from the direction of the Terran hegemony, thereby isolating a large chunk of the Federation. The first phase of the campaign, beginning in January 2407, got off to a great start for the Draconis Combine. It wasn't until Morningside that the Lyran Commonwealth was able to muster enough of a defence to stop their advance. Worried that losing Arcturus would cause the collapse of the Lyran administration, Alistair Marsden made the decision to move the capital to his homeworld of Tharkad, leaving the construction of this new government complex to his new wife, Catherine Steiner. Meanwhile, Lyran intelligence had pinpointed the location.
Catherine. Very Russian of you.
Of a major staging post on Vega. Recognizing
Or
the threat of a
Austrian,
second wave,
really.
Marsden launched a preemptive raid in early 2408, devastating the unprepared defenders. Wheeling back around to respond to calls for aid coming from Menkent, Alistair arrived to reinforce the beleaguered defenders on January 28th, where he took personal command of the 311th Sky Armored Cavalry. Morale was high, and the fledgling Lyran armed forces seemed to be finally coming together behind their Archon. 3 days later, Alistair was killed during an attack. While the Lyran command reeled from this loss, Catherine quickly seized control of the Archon ship. She was able to free more forces by inviting the Terran hegemony to station its own troops on the jointly held worlds that they had negotiated with their neighbours, a practice the hegemony had employed in other areas of the Inner Sphere as well. On Leon, the HAF was able to repulse a Kurita attack, but this was the only confrontation between the two. Catherine was able to secure her seat of power by dispatching her major rivals to the front lines. In March, they were able to win a major victory at Meacham, but in due course, all would be counted among the list of casualties. Controversially, Catherine also reverted her name from Marsden back to Steiner, and her son Alistair would be known as Marsden Steiner. Robert Kurita's campaign was finally abandoned in 2409, but raids between the two nations continued, perpetuating the constant state of war developing across the Inner Sphere. An assassin's bullet to the head would spell the end for Robert Kurita in 2412, with the coordinatorship
This is becoming a trend with Kurita.
passing to his brother. His campaign had not made a single notable gain for the Draconis Combine, and yet, unknown to himself at his time of death, he would perhaps make the single greatest impact on House Kurita of any individual since Shiro himself. First, he had unleashed House Steiner, mortal enemy of the Kurisans, onto the Inner Sphere. Second, after the birth of his nephew Nihongi von Rose, his prior actions would result in the near extinction of his house. In 2412, a Free Worlds League invasion force landed on Tintervel with the intent of liberating the planet from its Liao occupiers. What transpired became known as the Tintervel Massacre, when unrestrained use of firepower led to the devastation of the civilian population and hundreds of thousands of casualties. The Capellan Chancellor, Alicia Liao, was so incensed by the violence that she was compelled to begin an initiative that would forever change the way wars were waged within the Inner Sphere. Inviting the heads of government from each of the 6 major powers, as well as 4 minor ones, to a peace conference on Aries, Alicia laid out a proposal to severely restrict the use of WMDs, as well as strictly define where military engagements could take place and who could be targeted. The reception to these proposals was largely positive, but the reasons for the signatories giving their approval varied. Alicia herself wanted peace, but the martial Kuritans, for example, approved of the honourable new style of combat. Though some were skeptical, each member nation understood
Okay, I finally found a Leo that I don't like.
the possibility that the
Well, I'm okay with, I guess. Sorry.
others would unite against them if they refused to sign, and so almost all did. Crucially though, 2 refused. The mistrustful Taurians suspected a trick and withdrew from talks, but the United Hindu Collective declined for a different reason, suspecting that these articles could actually legitimize and legalize warfare as a means of settling disputes and thus lead to further conflict. History would show that to be an incredible display of foresight on their part. The Aries Conventions are lauded as one of the great documents of human history, but their significance is often overstated. Though they did result in a gradual shift away from more destructive methods of fighting, a closer look at the content of the articles reveals just how toothless the documents actually are. First of all, no reprimands or penalties are defined by the conventions at all, giving the signatories no basis for action should one of the rivals resort to the use of WMDs or civilian casualties during an attack. The only repercussion then could be the retaliatory use of such tactics by the offended party, thereby breaking the conventions themselves. This was more or less the state of affairs before the Aries Convention, where the concept of mutually assured destruction acted as a deterrent to the use of WMDs. Furthermore, the conventions only govern the use of unconscionable tactics between signatories, leaving several major loopholes. Firstly, nations who did not sign left themselves vulnerable, as the Taurian Concordat would soon discover. Pirates were expressly permitted as fair game, and so not surprisingly, the definition of pirates expanded wildly after the signing, and so-called pirates appeared up and down all the borders. Lastly, internal conflicts were not covered by the restrictions, and so civilians would continue to suffer during times of civil war.
Of course.
Another problem with the Aries Conventions was that despite being tabled in 2412, they wouldn't come into effect for some time afterwards. For example, the Federated Sun's representative at the meeting was Simon Davion. The so-called twin tyrants who were the presidents of the Federated Sun in the early 25th century did not acknowledge his decision to sign, and so it wasn't until Simon came to power some years later that the Federated Sons officially adopted them. Other nations too had their own delays. In practical terms then, the Aries conventions were hampered by a number of problems, and this is best demonstrated by the fact that over the next century each of the signatory nations would make use of WMDs when convenient. The problem was serious enough that the Capellan Confederation and Federated Sons signed their own pact on Lee prohibiting the use of nuclear arms against each other. However, despite its flaws in imposing limitations on the use of WMDs and restricting civilian targets, ultimately the conventions would lead to a reduction in the number of casualties. Unfortunately, the conventions would result in an increase in the number of engagements fought between nations. Strategically insignificant sized units suddenly had the ability to contest worlds within the framework outlined by the Aries conventions.
Yay!
Even in defeat, they could withdraw to argue the issue again another day. Therefore, fighting increased, but the strategic gains and accomplishments decreased. Border worlds became a seesaw of back and forth, with rulers changing on a yearly or even monthly basis. Despite being lauded as bringing about the idea of civilized warfare, if anything, the Aries conventions proliferated the idea of war as a means to an end. One final amendment was added to the conventions in the late 26th century. It is an amendment that is too often overlooked and forgotten about. In 2579, shortly after the creation of the Star League, all 6 member states unanimously voted to rescind the Aries conventions in their entirety, paving the way for the atrocities of the Reunification War.
Hooray!
In 2412, the various nations of the Ionosphere came together to sign the Aries Conventions. The set of rules outlawed the use of WMDs and restricted who could be fired upon during an engagement, as well as where those engagements could take place. It's ironic that the nation whose initiative had spawned the Aries Conventions was also the first nation to break them.
Of course!
Alicia Liao passed away in 2415 and was replaced by Arden Baxter. Baxter spent his time in power doing 2 things. The first was curtailing the Liao family's influence. The second was beginning the Rim War against the Taurian Concordat in 2418.
Hooray!
The next 4 years of fighting would see some of the most brutal of the entire Age of War. Since the Concordat was not a signatory of the Aries Conventions, Baxter proclaimed that his forces did not have to abide by them either. Nuclear attacks and worse were frequently deployed against the Taurians, who retaliated with their own arsenal of WMDs. By the war's end, only 3 planets had been won by the Capellans, and those worlds were now barren wastelands.
Congratulations, assholes!
Between the Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth during this period as well, with several planets falling to the latter. Fresh on the heels of his victory over the Capellans during the Andurien War, Peter Marek was again chosen as Captain General, and in 2416 was dispatched to retake the Lost Worlds. Their main objective was to dislodge the Lyran occupation force on Dieudonné. During this time, Peter Marek was hamstrung by the interference of his own government. Eventually, Parliament was even able to install an oversight committee to control his actions. Despite this, he was able to succeed in his counterattack against the Commonwealth, and even pushed ahead with an ill-advised attack on Rochelle in 2418. By taking this planet, so crucial to the Federation of Sky economy, he had effectively ensured that long-term peace was an impossibility. When the Lyrans inevitably launched another invasion just 2 years later, he had become so tired of the backroom government deals that he refused the role of Captain General outright. In their desperation, Parliament turned to a member of House Stuart, the second and last time a non-Marek would hold the post, but the results were less than stellar. By 2427, the Lyrans had continued to push rimward, and even a major counterattack in Fedi 2 failed to recover the Lost Worlds. It would fall to a second Peter Marek to reverse their fortunes. By now, the situation was dire enough that he was able to force the League Parliament to rescind the restrictions they placed on the Captain General, giving him access to the funds he needed and the flexibility to act aggressively. His audacious plan called for a deep thrust towards the capital of the Lyran Commonwealth, Tharkad. Beginning in 2441, he began his advance, and within 5 years was almost within striking distance of the capital. Knowing how isolated his position was on the salient he had created within the Lyran Commonwealth, and how vulnerable his supply lines were behind him, he smartly sued for peace. The captured worlds would, unsurprisingly, return to Steiner control in time, but Marek now had the time to strengthen his defense, as well as his family's position within government.
That's smart. That's actually intelligent to not sit there and continue to go, because he could have wound up dooming his entire nation, and then the Steiners would be sending out Atlas scouting parties all over the entire western side of the map.
Seeking to settle the dispute once and for all, the latest Captain General, Gerok Marek, launched yet another assault in 2455. Beginning on the world of Alula Borealis, and then forcing the Lyrans off Bela the following year, Geralt established a brutal reputation for himself, using strategies that made a mockery of the Aries conventions. Such was the perception of him among the Lyrans that they took to calling him the Bloodthirsty Giant. Later that year, he launched an invasion of Lorik, where the fighting was as fierce as ever. Steiner was not prepared to let the planet go, and the invasion bogged down, drawing on for another 3 years. By 2459, Geralt was preparing to make yet another strike against the remaining Lyran-held continent. As he moved his regiments into position though, he spotted a dozen great silhouettes on the horizon. Confident of his numerical superiority, Geralt pressed ahead, straight into the jaws of death. A blizzard of fire met them on approach, and soon the entire line was collapsing. The Free Worlds League had just stumbled into the first deployment of Lyran battlemechs in history, and immediately paid the price. Only a single mech was taken out of action at the cost of dozens of Marikama. Undeterred, Geralt ordered his reserves into the fray. Reports differ on his state of mind during this final moment. Had he gone mad, or was he determined to make a heroic last stand against the Lyran juggernauts? Either way, there was nothing heroic about Geralt's demise, crushed underfoot by this new mechanical monstrosity.
Dawn of the Battlemechs.
No history of the Inner Sphere will be complete without dedicating special attention to one of the most iconic features of the modern battlefield. The rise to prominence of these new war machines had a revolutionary influence on the way battles were fought, and on the balance of power between the nations, as the haves went up against the have-nots. In 2439, the Terran hegemony completed work on the first prototype Battlemech, an evolution of the technology present in industrial mechs that had become popular by the early 25th century. The first mech design, known as the Mackie, incorporated what was at the time cutting-edge tech and a weapons payload to match even the largest armoured vehicles. This 100-ton behemoth made use of a neurohelmet for its pilot, allowing for intuitive and complete control over all systems at a level that surpassed the efficiency and precision of a traditional multi-crew tank. Colonel Charles Kincaid had the honour of giving the Mackie its first combat trial against a platoon of remote-controlled tanks, and made short work of his opponents, ushering in the age of the Battlemech. News of these developments spread across the Inner Sphere, and the hegemony's neighbours took notice. The hegemony expanded their
beware the military-industrial complex and dick guns
arsenal, introducing the Kudo and Banshee in short order, and began construction on a number of assemblies across the nation. One heavily fortified location was built within the mountains of Hesperus, which was at the time a jointly owned world between the Terrans and the Federation of Sky. No one knew at the time, but this particular facility would become one of the central locations in the next 500 years of history. The first recorded combat involving mechs took place during a Kurita raid on Styx in 2443, where a single hegemony lance took on and destroyed the Draconis Combine invaders. Every side now began scrambling for blueprints that would allow them to design and build their own battlemech. Various attempts at espionage, trade agreements, bribery and assault were undertaken by the different factions. Despite the best efforts of the Terran hegemony, the knowledge would eventually disseminate across the Inner Sphere to all of the great houses and periphery nations. The number of different mech designs thus exploded, with every side working to field units of their own. 36 years after their first combat trial, the first mech versus mech action took place between the Draconis Combine and the Lyran Commonwealth. From then on, the history of the Inner Sphere would never be the same again. Battlemechs were designed to take advantage of two technological developments. The first was the invention of artificial muscles, known as myomas, by Dr. Gregory Atlas in the mid-24th century. The tensile strength of myomas was Herculean, far surpassing even the most optimistic predictions of the scientists behind it. The second came shortly after the first mechs took to the field, and that was a new form of lightweight ablative armour consisting of layers of titanium steel alloys, ceramics, and artificial diamonds. At first, this new armour was limited in its construction, leading to many early mech designs being box-like in shape, but later models had greater variety. Early designs were primitive.
Bring me the Irby, give me the AC-20.
By today's standards. Recognizing the need to maintain their technological edge, the hegemony refined.
Okay, the Mackie's introduced. 4 years later, the Kaidu. 2 years after that, the Banshee, the Orion, the Archer, the Battle Axe, the Helopoli. I have no idea. Griffin, Ymir, Commando, the Wasp. This is not a very, very long time. This is like 31 years until you're sitting there with the crossbow and the gladiator and the Shadowhawk. Oh. Awesome sauce. Awesome sauce. The Urban Make, baby. Yeah, today is garbage day. Nice.
their work and were able to field more advanced units for some years, sometimes even decades, before their neighbors were able to catch up.
Thunderbolt, guillotine.
They maintained this tech advantage in
the rifleman.
all matters
The Warhammer.
throughout most of the Age of War. Mechs offered a number of advantages over conventional armor. As previously mentioned, the natural synergy between mined and bipedal mech could result in increased performance compared to traditional vehicles. This design also gave extra maneuverability and allowed for actions such as rolling, crawling, and even scaling mountainsides, feats that would be totally impossible in tracked or wheeled units. Perhaps one of the largest contributing factors to the prevalence of mech designs during this period was how well they integrated with the pre-established Aries conventions. This way, a small elite team of mech warriors could fight an entire campaign over a planet, and at far lesser cost than a full army from previous centuries.
Truth.
This in turn had an unexpected consequence, as those pilots became increasingly romanticized by the everyday public to the point where they were viewed as modern-day knights in armor. In time, this would develop into a warrior elite, a new class of nobility, continuing to change the perception of modern warfare. One aspect of mech design that is often incorrectly perceived is their size. The typical mech is around a dozen meters tall, with the lighter chassis sometimes coming in under 10 and the tallest reaching to around 14 meters. The misconception that they're taller than this often stems from people who have never actually seen one in the field, or sometimes propaganda, commercial vid tapes, or even video games misrepresenting their size. The Interstellar nations would quickly settle on a standardized form of organizing their mech forces, based on multiples of 3, an evolution of earlier armored units. The basic building block was the Lance, a quartet of mechs designed to complement each other's abilities, or, as the number of mechs increased, simplify logistics. A trio of lances formed a company, and a trio of companies a battalion, often with an additional command lance attached. 3 battalions would form a regiment, which would typically have a command team of 2 lances on top, though the size of this unit varied.
Mathis, actually, not really. Not really. You would have to look. Squad sizes for Space Marines are going to vary by chapter, of course, but still. And if you're thinking for scale, a Warhound Titan is around. A Reaver, I believe, is close to that.
In the Age of War, larger units than regiments were almost always a mixture of mechs and traditional armor. Though each of the great houses would eventually field great numbers of these new units, there was a brief period in history when a single house was able to acquire the technology early, profit greatly from it, and then employ their new marvels in a crushing invasion of their neighbours in what we now know today as Steiner's Long March. The Battlemech construction facilities on Hesperus have a long and storied history, going back to their very inception. Over the past 250 years, no fewer than 13 major battles have been fought for the control or destruction of these mountain complexes. But 300 years before even the first of those, Hesperus was the site of a major Lyran covert operation, the success of which would change the course of history. Hesperus was at the time a jointly owned world shared between the Federation of Sky and the Terran hegemony. With the advent of the Battlemech, the hegemony needed secure sites to construct these behemoths. That they chose somewhere outside of their own borders at first seems absurd, but the fact that these facilities would survive the collapse of the Star League and the ravages of the Succession Wars just goes to show that they chose wisely. The Lyran Intelligence Corps immediately began efforts to infiltrate the facility and steal the plans, but their efforts were blocked at every turn. When Catherine Steiner abdicated in favour of her son Alistair, the new Archon began formulating plans that would take a more direct approach to acquiring the blueprints. It was February 7th, 2455, and one of the last outbound dropships of the day was departing when suddenly an explosion illuminated the night sky. The dropship had suffered a major malfunction and was now plummeting to Earth. Its trajectory was quickly calculated as crashing into the compound. The alarm was raised and the night staff at the Battlemech facility was frantically evacuated, while the pilot fought to slow the descent. Aboard the ship, the occupants held on for dear life and prayed that their pilot was up to the job he'd been hired for, hoping all the while that their deliberate detonation wouldn't be followed with a fiery explosion upon impact with the ground. As fate would have it, the crew was able to arrest their downwards momentum just as the ship disappeared behind the high mountain walls and touched down safely, if somewhat ungracefully. Disembarking, a crack team of 25 LIC operatives led by Colonel Simon Kelsois hurriedly made their way into the now deserted facility and began to hack into the mainframe. The hegemony guards quickly realized something was amiss and approached the miraculously intact dropship, only before a second detonation utterly destroyed the dropship and much of the surrounding area. This bought the infiltration team enough time to copy 90% of their target files before the order was given to withdraw, whereupon they escaped into the mountains. A short time later, they regrouped at a civilian starport and boarded a second freighter, headed deeper into Lyran space.
Nice!
Operation Prometheus was a success. With the Battlemech plans now in their possession, the Lyrans became only the second nation to field the latest technological advancement, and immediately began construction of their own units. These would see their combat debut on Lorik in 2459, where Captain General Gerok Marik became the first leader of one of the great houses to die at the hands, or in his case feet, of a Battlemech.
There we go.
Alistair knew that there was a lot to be gained from his nation's new technological advantage, but also understood that continued proliferation of Battlemech technology was inevitable. The Federated Suns soon came knocking, seeking a trade agreement that would grant them access to the stolen data. Recognizing that there was little to fear from this distant nation, the savvy Lyrans were able to charge an extortionate fee that would bolster their economy. Furthermore, Davion mechs would soon become a thorn in the side of their rivals, the Kuritans. Recognizing the danger, the Draconis Combine organized their own raid on the new Lyran construction facilities on Coventry. Theirs was a more direct assault, but was nonetheless successful, and so now 4 of the nations had the tech. The retributions for the failure to defend the compound were severe, spreading a discontent among the workers that would ultimately lead to certain of them defecting to the Free Worlds League, bringing with them the valuable blueprints. The League in turn would suffer its own defections to the Capellan Confederation sometime after. Even the periphery nations got in on the act. The Rimworld's Republic had actually contributed to Operation Prometheus, and though they lacked complete schematics, they hit the ground running once they were finally able to secure the missing pieces.
Nice.
Recognizing that the time to act was now, while the other nations were still in the early stages of development, Alistair began preparing for what would become known as the Long March campaign. Lyran Battlemechs first descended on the border worlds of Nox, Scondia and Trolloc Prime, easily scattering the Kuritan defenders. The next major target was Caldria, but here they faced more stubborn resistance. The DTMS had dug into the mountains, and repeated assaults had failed to dislodge them. As the death toll mounted, Lyran commanders began to discuss the unspeakable. One final assault was attempted that saw an elite group of mech warriors scale the near vertical mountain walls to attack from the rear, but an ambush caught the entire unit by surprise and they were summarily destroyed. By doing so, the Kuritan commander had just signed a death warrant for his entire garrison. The Steiner troops withdrew to a safe distance and watched as nuclear missiles rained down on the complex,
Because if you can't beat them, nuke them.
obliterating the occupants and leaving nothing behind of the once mighty fortifications. The Long March campaign was a two-front war, however, and fighting was every bit as fierce on the Free Worlds front. Here things progressed at a slower pace, but the Lyrans were able to make some advances. The invasion would finally come to a halt during their attempts to retake the world of Alula Borealis, one of those captured by the bloodthirsty giant Gerok Marik. Here the fighting would continue for years, but it was the arrival of fresh Free Worlds League military reinforcements that turned the tide. The Lyran troops got a bitter taste of their own medicine when lumbering over the hills towards them came the first of the Marik Battlemechs. Robert Kurita, the warmongering coordinator of the Draconis Combine, was assassinated in 2412, bringing to an end his reign of misdeeds. Though it was never proven, the common belief is that it was orchestrated as a revenge killing by his sister Marika, as retribution for killing her lover, Werner von Rose, a stable boy who had been deemed to be beneath her station. Marika was already pregnant at the time, and shortly before the Age of War began, gave birth to Nahongi von Rose, named for his grandfather, who shared a love of horses. Raised from birth to have a deep
What is the deal with horses?
hatred of the ruling Kurita line, the child would in time come closer to extinguishing the Kurita family than either of their long-term rivals, the Davions and Steiners, have ever been. In Robert's place rose his brother Parker, an uninspired leader who achieved little of note during his time as coordinator. It was perhaps because of this that Nahongi was able to begin winning the support of several military officers with talk of ousting Parker. The death of the third brother, Saigo, during a raid on Vega in 2419 created somewhat of a succession crisis. Though illegitimate, Nahongi was now the closest blood relative to Parker, and next in line for the throne. Only a single thing now stood in his way, the support of a major Kurita backer. Decades earlier, the Urizen branch of the Kurita family had established themselves as the military governors of the Principality of Razelhag. A significant portion of the population had always chafed under the rule of a foreign realm, however, and in 2375 orchestrated a terrorist bombing that saw almost the complete destruction of the Urizen branch. Jason Kurita, Urizen's great-grandson, survived the blast, but was seriously mentally scarred by the death of almost his entire family. In time, he would unleash a campaign of brutality against the people he governed. Also surviving the blast was his sister Oma, who had been whisked away by the rebels and was held in seclusion under the watchful eye of the Sorensen family. Before any demands were made, fate dealt an unexpected hand when Oma fell in love with her would-be kidnapper, eventually giving birth to a son, Daniel Sorensen. When Jason finally learned his sister was alive, he launched an attack to recover her from the rebels, most of whom were killed during the fighting. Grief-stricken by the death of her husband, Oma never recovered, and passed away a few years later, around the time that another illegitimate child was born, Nahongi von Rose. Jason and Nahongi fell into league together, the latter promising great rewards and power in his new government, the same favours he was offering to all of his supporters. With Jason's support, it was now time to act on his master plan. In March of 2421, as the coordinator slept, his household guard was being cycled out and new men loyal to Nahongi took to their posts. As the palace woke the next morning, they found that Parker had been sentenced and executed within a few hours during the night, and the new coordinator now sat the throne. Though some units resisted the takeover.
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Where was it?
Next morning, they found that Parker had been sentenced and executed within a few hours during the night, and the new
Okay. That is quite literally somebody hitting all random in Oblivion.
Coordinator now sat the throne. Though some units resisted the takeover, reinforcements dispatched by Jason Kurita swiftly ensured the success of the coup. Nor was this the only killing that took place. Several co-conspirators were also summarily executed, as were certain members of the Kurita family, with many more being sent into exile. However, by sending his troops, Jason had opened up his own realm to the rebellion, and was soon facing serious opposition helmed by none other than his nephew Daniel Sorensen. Hearing of their distant cousin's escapades, the exiled members of the Kurita family flocked to his cause, and in another twist of fate, the Razelhag rebels became the Kurita loyalists. When Daniel came for Jason Kurita, the governor resisted arrest and tried to shoot his nephew, but was in turn killed by Sorensen. He now rose to prominence as the new Lord of Razelhag. Once again, the realm was a free and independent nation.
Yes!
Unfortunately for the citizens of the Draconis Combine, their lives became one of constant terror under the police state of the Von Rose. Shortly after his ascension, Nahongi took to styling himself purely by his family name, a trait that he would pass on to his children and successors. Many in the Combine today could not even tell you how many Von Rose coordinators there were, as the entire family withdrew into seclusion and ruled without contact with the outside world. The rest of the 25th century played out without much of note for us historians to look into. After securing plans to construct Battlemechs, the Von Rose were able to reverse the losses suffered during the Long March campaign. One of the chief tools in this victory was the self-styled Draconis mech, the Von Rose. By 2497, an unusual situation had developed in the Benjamin District worlds close to the Terran hegemony. The Azami people had gradually established majority governorship of several planets and formed their own breakaway nation within the borders of the Draconis Combine. The Von Rose coordinator at the time dispatched an invasion force to subjugate these people, but the assault would unfold with disturbing parallels to an old Earth tale known as the War of the Worlds. As unspeakable atrocities were committed, the Draconis forces came into contact with the blood of the dead civilians. The dead bodies and the hot temperatures of the Azami worlds, coupled with the latent virus present in the blood, created a plague that would wipe out the entire invasion force down to the last man.
Well, there you go.
Also during this period, new attempts were made to reconcile the Draconis Combine with the Principality of Razelhag.
Dunkel Waller Dunkel Flussen Schlottenfeld named Bob in 2789.
Martin McAllister was dispatched as an ambassador to treat with Blaine Sorensen. Unexpectedly, or perhaps as Sorensen had orchestrated, he found himself falling in love with Blaine's daughter Ileana. The love proved genuine, and in time the couple would celebrate the birth of their daughter.
Yay!
Sidorwan McAllister was born in February 2496 and would go on to become one of the most influential individuals in the history of the Inner Sphere. Certainly the exploits of her life are deserving of a special focus, but for the time being she was just a child, and so for now we'll leave her out of the history, though she was present at several of the key meetings and events of this era. McAllister and Sorensen meanwhile were formulating their own plans. Martin was dispatched on several lengthy trips to Razelhag under the guise of building relations between the two realms. The Von Rohrs remained oblivious to his true intentions, and he continued to work his way up the chain of command until he was one of the most powerful individuals within the Combine. Even still, Martin remained unsure whether he had even met a member of the Von Rohr household, so secretive was that ruling family. In 2508, Coordinator Yama was abruptly imprisoned and removed from office by troops loyal to McAllister. A new Von Rohr was hurriedly sworn in, but confusion reigned, as neither the new coordinator understood what charges had been laid against his brother and how he suddenly now held a position of apparent supreme power, nor did the government functionaries and military leaders understand who was even the new coordinator. The Von Rohr family's grip on the Combine started to falter. In 2510, Blaine Sorensen unexpectedly launched a major invasion of the Combine. All available troops were dispatched to meet this attack, leaving the palace on New Samarkand open to a strike. McAllister chose this moment to assault the coordinator's residence. With no one quite sure as to the identities of those within, a brutal purge was conducted that saw the entire population of the compound wiped out, Von Rohr and servants alike. In an instant, the family that had ruled the Draconis Combine for almost a century was extinguished. In the aftermath, the militaries of the two powers were hastily stood down to avoid further bloodshed. Sorensen's attack had been nothing but a ruse, and Martin and Blaine met on the world of Pesht to make an announcement that would shock the Combine. Many years earlier, Sorensen had insisted that McAllister take a DNA analysis, which had proven beyond a doubt that Martin was in fact a blood descendant of Shiro Kurita, the founding father of the Draconis Combine.
Okay.
His marriage to Ilyana meant that the two families were now bound by blood, and plans were drawn up to fully integrate the Principality of Razelhag as a part of the Combine, achieving what Urizen had set out to do almost 200 years earlier. Blaine Sorensen was confirmed in his new position as Duke of Razelhag. Furthermore, 6 years later, a representative from the Azami people approached McAllister, and the two groups were reconciled, those worlds also returning to the fold as a semi-autonomous region.
Okay.
With these changes, the Draconis Combine as we would recognise it today was fully formed. Martin McAllister became the 10th coordinator, bringing to an end the 89 years of Von Rohr reign. For the first time in history, the Combine would know peace, and though the occasional border raid would break the spell, for the Kuritan citizens the age of war had ended early. The Davion.
So they've checked out. So Kuritans are done. Who's next?
The Civil War may well be the darkest chapter in the history of the Federated Suns, and potentially of the entire Age of War. Certainly it dwarfs the other major conflicts of this era in terms of scale and in importance, with the rule of the largest interstellar nation going to the victor. It would begin with the kidnapping of the heir apparent by one of the regents sworn to protect him, and end with single combat to the death between two allies that had fought the war together.
Huh.
Though we know it today as the Davion Civil War, two alternate titles might have been the War of the Regents or the War of the Five Princes. The
War of the Roses.
Federated Suns had managed to keep its nose clean throughout most of the 25th century, allowing it to peacefully expand outwards and in time become the largest of all the great nations. Certainly there were border disputes and raids with their neighbours the Capellan Confederation, Taurian Concordat and later the Draconis Combine, but no major campaigns had been waged by them or against them. The situation had become stable enough that in 2511 they were even able to peacefully negotiate an arrangement with their rivals the Taurian Concordat to split the border world of Malagrotta between them.
Okay.
To understand the origins of the war, we need to look back at the reforms made by Simon Davion after taking office as the Federated Suns' final president in 2417. The realm by this point had become so massive that no bureaucracy could hope to govern it effectively. He thus determined that his nation should be divided at an administrative level into 5 principalities, or marches. The new regions would be the Capellan, Crucis, Draconis, Outer and Terran marches, each governed by a prince who had supreme authority in his region. The head of the Crucis March would be known as the First Prince, first among equals, and later that century officially became a hereditary Davion position.
Right.
Relative to the rest of the Inner Sphere, this was just the latest in a sweep of changes that were seeing humanity slide further from democracy and towards feudalism. Jumping forwards to the early 26th century, First Prince William Davion ruled the Federated Suns, but had recently suffered a great loss with the death of his son fighting on the Capellan front. His 5-year-old grandson, Alexander, thus became his heir. William was still in his 40s, so there was no fear of a succession crisis, with plenty of time for Alexander to age and still other children besides. Fate, however, had different plans for the Federated Suns.
Perfect.
A vicious plague swept over New Avalon, killing millions, the First Prince included. In his dying moments, he reaffirmed Alexander as heir, and passed his badges of office to his 2 surviving daughters, Laura Davion and Cassandra Varney Davion. This was taken to mean that he meant for them to act as regents. Both women were intelligent and ambitious individuals, and so to temper the deal, the High Council decided that 5 regents would rule together until Alexander came of age in his 20s. Laura and Cassandra each had 1 pick, while the Council would put forward the 5th name. Before continuing, let's quickly review who the 5 princes were at the time of William's passing.
Okay.
The Terran March was ruled from Robinson by Charles Latham. On Tancredi IV, Vladimir Kerensky commanded the Draconis March, and Nuno Gutierrez was the Outer March Prince on Filtveld. The most powerful was Charles Varney, Duke of New Syrtis and Prince of the Capellan March. He was the head of the Varney family, which had been steadily growing in power as rivals to the Davions over the last century.
Alright.
The Cruces March was ruled in theory by the young Alexander, but the regents would wield the power once chosen. At first, it wasn't clear that any of the other princes would hold one of the regencies, as the 5 principalities were very much independent at this point in history. Cassandra made her first power play when she chose as her nominee regent her husband, David Varney, Prince of the Capellan March, an ambitious and cunning man in his own right. By choosing one of the 5 princes, Cassandra had assured that her decisions as regent would have tremendous support in the upper echelons of society.
Okay.
Laura countered this by choosing the respected General Nikolai Rostov, thereby winning the support of the Federated peacekeeping forces.
Okay.
Though their ties were not as close as the married couple, the two would often vote in the same direction on most matters, at least at first. In the hope of curbing some of the sisters' more aggressive tendencies, the council nominated William's widow, their own mother, Carmen Estevez Davion, as the 5th regent. Their hope was short-lived, however, when the faltering health of Carmen forced her to retire to her homeworld for the remainder of her life. As she left, she gave Laura Davion full authority to vote on her behalf, effectively doubling her influence among the regents. The squabbling began almost immediately when the Varneys moved to have Alexander betrothed to their daughter, Cynthia, who would in turn be named as the heir apparent. This was aggressively opposed by Laura, but succeeded in part when Rostov supported the betrothal, if not the immediate naming of an heir. This was a politically savvy move by him, and the first sign that he had his own ambitions and the mind to achieve them. By agreeing,
the puppy's upstairs, getting attention. He's just probably upset because, you know, the wife wasn't around him for 4.5 seconds. This happens quite a lot.
into the proposal, he had ingratiated himself with the Varneys and bought time for himself and Laura to make their own plans. He correctly reasoned that the Varneys would not be so cutthroat in their pursuit of power if they believed they had a route through marriage. The political balance swung further in Laura's favour when she used Carmen's vote and Rostov's support to elect herself as the new prince, the term was the same regardless of gender, of the Draconis March after Kerensky died childless. But the Varneys were not bested by this manoeuvre, and in 2515 proposed Nikolai Rostov as the replacement prince for the Terran March.
Yeah, I can't ever tell if you guys are talking about that puppy, because that puppy will not shut up for love or money.
After an HAF raid had wiped out the Leighton family. For fear of alienating her supporter, Laura agreed, but from this point on, Rostov would be the deciding vote on all issues. At first, the regents contented themselves to stay out of each other's way as they steadily increased their own power.
So this whole civil war was kicked off by a massive succession crisis. Just a massive succession crisis, and that was it.
And influence, but things started to develop at an increasing pace when Carmen Estevez Davion passed away in 2518. With Laura and Rostov occupied repelling Kurita and Terran raids on their own borders, the Varneys took the initiative and moved against the High Council next. Fabricating evidence against numerous members, they began the so-called treason trials, gutting that government body and leaving only those loyal to themselves. Also left untouched was any politician with ties to the Terran March, as they continued to court Rostov's support. The High Council of the Federated Sons was so cowed by this that they never nominated a replacement for the position of 5th regent. Laura insisted that her right to vote on her mother's behalf remained even in death, which the Varneys were obviously opposed to.
Of course.
Nikolai, meanwhile, was continuing to grow his own reputation by repeatedly defeating HAF invaders. However, he had become less active in the governing of New Avalon, preferring instead to stick to the Terran March, where he had become something of a legend. Using his new fame to her advantage, Laura was able to contrast his successes against recent Varney failures on the Capellan front in order to build support for a proposal that would see Rostov made First Marshal of the entire FBF. In an error of judgment, Cassandra voted against this to protect her husband's reputation, who was still busy fighting at the front, but in so doing...
Okay, hold on a second.
Maybe he wants to say hi to everybody.
Yeah, he wants to say a lot. Come here, little stinker. Hi, come here. Oh.
Turn around so he can give you kisses.
Oh no. Okay, hi. Say hey to everybody. Oh god. Oh god.
No, he wants mommy.
Oh god. Oh god. Please. Please.
Oh, he says, give me kisses.
Okay, I'm hugging you. I'm hugging you. Can I hug you?
He's gonna have a fit because he's.
I know he's gonna have a fit. He's beating my arm with his tail right now. I'm giving you hugs. I'm giving you attention. Will you please love me?
What is your problem? What is the problem?
Oh god. Oh god, he's got. Okay. Fine.
Look at the tail now. Look at the tail.
Could you get him? It's a beast, Kenneth. It's a beast. Oh. Caiaphas Canine, hero of the Imperium.
Doing pushed Rostov back into Laura's camp. It was the Varnays who moved first to break the stalemate that had developed. In 2524, Alexander was taken from his home on New Avalon to New Syrtis under the guise of touring the realm.
Oh, of
he
course.
had ostensibly been kidnapped.
Yes.
When secured in the Capellan March, they hurriedly married him to their daughter and waited for the young couple to produce a Varnay heir to the throne. In response, Laura shot
That's one way to get things down to business.
Annie when she arrived on New Avalon with a powerful army at her back. She had managed to conclude a peace agreement with the Kuritans, allowing her to take the fight to the Varnay faction, beginning with the puppet councillors left after the treason trials. After carrying out her retribution, she could now claim de facto leadership over 2 of the marches and all of the military forces within them. Rostov stirred himself too in support of Laura, and they began preparations for a civil war. Nuno Gutierrez would remain officially neutral throughout the war. His own principality was too vulnerable on the periphery to get involved, though he would have to placate the Varnays on occasion, as they were some of his key trading partners. To weaken the Varnay claim, Laura began an aggressive propaganda campaign accusing them of kidnapping the young prince. To counter this, David took
you can't really accuse them of something that they did.
Alexander on a tour of the Capellan March, but in May of 2525, the news that the Varnays had been waiting for arrived. Cynthia had given birth to a son. They had, however, misjudged one crucial part of their plan, the loyalty of their own daughter. Cynthia had become aware of her father's intent to kill her husband and began conspiring to see him freed. Celebrations began on numerous worlds as word spread of the new heir's birth, providing the perfect opportunity for Alexander to give his captors the slip and disappear into exile with a tiny band of loyal followers. This final chapter of pre-war build-up was punctuated by the invasion of Davion troops into the Capellan March. It might be expected that other surrounding nations would have played a part in the war, taken advantage of Davion vulnerability. In actuality, the Draconis Combine was entering the most peaceful period in its history, and the Terran hegemony was increasingly adopting the role of galactic conciliator. The Capellan Confederation was ruled by the bloodthirsty tyrant Calvin Liao, but he had his sights set on Andurien. The Taurian Concordat realised they had more to lose than gain by getting involved, plus the Outlaws Alliance and United Hindu Collective continued their attitude of armed neutrality. Therefore, the Davion Civil War remained a strictly internal affair. The war began when Nikolai and Laura moved forces across the border into Varnay territory. The first target for the Davion soldiers was the world of Cluain. Rostov's troops, consisting of the Terran Brigade and the elite Vale Rangers, had years of experience fighting under him, and were veterans of many battles against the Terran hegemony. On many occasions they outfought the numerically superior Varnay militia. Nikolai was also able to use a strategy of feints to draw Varnay forces into a trap.
Well, really, is it luck? Is it luck if you brutalize yourselves to the point of absurdity? I mean, that's not luck in my view.
Early on in the war, he withdrew from Salem in the face of fresh reinforcements and retreated to Torkot. Thinking they had him on the run, he was pursued, but when the Varnay forces arrived, they found the main population centres deserted and key infrastructure and food supplies destroyed. David Varnay himself departed to take personal command of what he believed would be a decisive battle in the war. What he hadn't anticipated was that Rostov was deliberately avoiding the fight until the Varnay invaders had become complacent in their defence around the starport. When Varnay was only a few hours from landfall, Rostov launched a surprise raid that caught the Capellan March militia mid-preparations and devastated their strength. When David arrived, he quickly assessed that his position was untenable and organised an orderly retreat. His vengeance would come only a few weeks later at Quitakas, where the Davion faction was dealt a heavy blow. Nikolai Rostov was killed in a trivially small engagement during the invasion of that world, robbing the FPF of their finest commander. Varney used this victory to incite several key members of the
They're dying.
opposing army to desert along with their regiments, and the campaign ground to a halt almost as soon as it had begun. With Nikolai dead, the principeship of the Terran March passed to his son Dmitry Rostov. At the time of his father's death, Dmitry had been fighting behind the lines in the Capellan March. Unable to organise an immediate response, he ordered what troops he could reach to disband and return to their worlds, while he would take an elite cadre of loyal forces and continue to operate in Varney territory, disrupting supply lines. This slowed the pace of the war significantly, and 25-26 passed without major engagement between the two factions. In February of the next year, General Bofors of the Varney militia became ensnared in a trap set by Laura on the planet Nahoni. The 1st New Avalon Dragoons, a light armour regiment under Colonel John Gordon, had been deliberately left in a vulnerable position to lure in an attack, which would in turn leave the invaders vulnerable to a counterattack by Laura's loyalists. An overwhelming force of 2 infantry divisions and a pair of Battlemech regiments led by Bofors descended on the world, more than enough to take care of the Dragoons.
This is a lot. This is a lot. This is hard to keep track of.
However, both sides were oblivious to one key piece of information. In January, Colonel Gordon had been approached by an unknown youth, who was revealed to be none other than Alexander Davion himself. Gordon's regiment had been chosen for this near-suicide mission because of their open admission of loyalty to the Lost Prince above loyalty to Laura. In the Dragoons, Alexander found the first unit willing to join his cause, and a third faction now joined the war. This was all news to Bofors, who waltzed into the swampy terrain of Nahoni, sure that his numerical superiority would carry the day. Colonel Gordon would make them regret their overconfidence by conducting a superb guerrilla campaign, fully utilising the advantages of his hovercraft and jump infantry amongst the bogs to defeat the militia wherever they were encountered.
They got into the bogs.
After repeatedly raiding Varney supplies, Bofors was embarrassingly forced to surrender to the far smaller New Avalon Dragoons. When the identity of their opponent became known to the Capellan troops, a significant portion switched sides, including some mech units, and the rest were held hostage to be ransomed back to the Varneys. Alexander demanded that his wife be released to join him on Nahoni, and under pressure from the Rump Council in exile on New Syrtis, Cassandra agreed. Bofors returned to Nahoni with Cynthia in tow, and began preparations to withdraw his troops. But 2 days later, Laura Davion's counterstroke fell on the astonished Varney forces, and the fighting began again in earnest. At this point though, Alexander made a serious error in judgment when he attacked one of Laura's units, thereby alerting her to his presence. Though this would again lead to defections and an upswell in the size of his army, it drew him into a pitched battle that his forces could scarcely afford. When General Bofors unexpectedly arrived on his flank, the scale of his blunder was revealed. Only because his two opponents were equally concerned with destroying each other was the young prince able to escape with a small corps of officers and mechs. In orbit, he was able to find more sympathizers, giving him the ability to escape the system, but it was not a strong start to his campaign. However, Alexander's chances of victory were buoyed when Dmitry Rostov learned of the First Prince's survival and threw his support behind him.
There we go!
This action proved divisive in the Terran March, as though his father had been hugely respected and Dmitry was a competent commander himself, the family had no historical ties to the region. Many worlds sided with Laura in the Draconis March. Dmitry found it necessary to move his administrative and military command to Farwell due to uncertain loyalties on Robinson. The war now entered a lull period, with each faction withdrawing to consolidate support within their own borders. At first, Laura tried to fight growing pro-Alexander sentiment in the Crucius March, but it soon became apparent that her foothold in the region had been lost, and she...
Friendly reminder... Hey! Thanks, Silent Warrior. Message me in Discord. I'm trying to set up something for that. I'm trying to set up some sort of P.O. box, something like that. If not, I'm going to give you my address to go ahead and ship them over here. I am ready for those. I am really ready for those. I am, if you guys don't know, you'll soon find out. I'm just saying.
She retreated to tank.
Definitely send me a message though, bud. Appreciate it.
Sat back and waited to see who their nephew would move against first. The civil war took an unexpected twist when Prince David was killed by anti-Varney rioters on Ashley, which threw the Colonial March forces into disarray. Alexander and Rostov saw this opportunity to avoid a two-front war by turning to deal with Laura and the Draconis March while Cassandra struggled to regain control of her own territory. To keep her off balance, Alexander tasked the now General Gordon with conducting a guerrilla campaign against Cassandra while he dealt with his other aunt. This next phase of the war did not go smoothly for the Crucis faction. First of all, Dmitry was more concerned with establishing his dominance within his own Terran March than moving against Laura. He dispatched only token reinforcements to aid Alexander in his push towards Tancredi, just enough to keep up the facade of their alliance. More troubling was the revelation that Alexander was a poor battlefield commander. His early victories, it seemed, had been more dependent on John Gordon, but now that he was absent, the flaws in Alexander's leadership came to light. The campaign quickly began to drag, and Crucis March forces made very slow progress. They were aided by defections among the Tancredi Warriors Brigade, the core of Laura's military strength, but this was not enough. Finally, in 2533, Rostov joined his strength with Alexander and accelerated their push through the Draconis March, with Dmitri taking most of the credit. They descended in force on Tancredi and came face to face with the elite of Laura's troops. The defenders held their ground in a valiant act of defiance, but eventually the line broke and Alexander closed on Laura's command post. Stepping forwards to meet them was General Katrinka of the Draconis March, who formally surrendered on behalf of the survivors. When they found Laura soon after, they were already too late. The elder of the two sisters had taken her own life, leaving a legacy of destruction and a lengthy suicide note that reaffirmed her defiance even in death.
There are those who will ask why. Some say that I spare because my forces cannot win the war, but that's not the reason. Some will also believe I cannot bear to live with the frustration of never again being able to rule the Federated Sons. I regret the loss of so many of my faithful troops. I appreciate the loyalty and call them a truce, but I hold they enter into a bargain with me to fight in return for good government. And possible for the rewards I would show them if victorious. They made a good bargain, but a bad bet. Huh. Okay.
The delays in conquering the Draconis March would cost Alexander dearly. While he had been held up fighting in the Corwood side of the realm, Cassandra Varney Davion had been marshalling her strength and had finally managed to corner General Gordon and his army. In an ironic twist, the world of Jaipur that had propelled Simon Davion into command of the Federated Sons a century ago and made possible the creation of the 5 Marches, was now the location for the scene of an atrocity.
Oh, of course.
Though Alexander moved to Gordon's rescue, he lacked the ability to conduct such an operation, and the general and his troops were forced to surrender to the Varnays. Cassandra had most of the prisoners executed en masse in flagrant disregard for the Aries conventions. As news spread, Alexander's own troops went on the rampage, the worst incident being the killing of civilians on Smolensk. The long war was taking a heavy toll on all sides. Beginning in 2534, Cassandra's forces, supported by large groups of Capellan Confederation mercenaries, began a major thrust into the Crucis March. Alexander was unable to mount a defence and found himself being pushed ever further back towards New Avalon. In an attempt to flank her opponent, Cassandra made the foolhardy decision to enter the United Hindu Collective.
That's a bad idea.
Until this point, they had remained neutral during the Davion Civil War, but now they rose to challenge the invaders. The core of the UHC military was the Messengers of Shiva Regiment, which represented the majority of their Battlemech and aerospace fighter strength. Cassandra's forces were intercepted in 2535 on Jodhpur, where the outdated UHC were able to achieve a victory over the Varnays, who they held as hostage until the end of the war.
Nice.
Back on the front line, however, things were not improving for the Crucis
Yes, let's just invade India. This will go well.
March forces. By the end of 2536, the Varnays had made it as far as El Dorado, and now prepared for a direct assault on the capital. Alexander's command on Belladonna could not see a way out of the situation. It was at this moment that Dmitri Rostov arrived and immediately entered into furious debate with Alexander. Both princes felt personally aggrieved by the other, Alexander angry at the lack of support, and Dmitri despairing at the seemingly incompetent boy general. Nevertheless, they knew Cassandra was the true enemy to them both, and Rostov had a plan to cripple the assault, abandon the defense of New Avalon, and strike out to the flanks of Cassandra's advance. A large force of Vale Rangers was stationed on Smolensk, ready to strike at her supply lines. Alexander was urged to move his troops around the Rimwood side, and the two forces would regroup behind the front line. The plan worked flawlessly. The Varnays attempted to withdraw, but were caught recharging in the Meghlan system.
Nice.
Cassandra's fleet was almost completely destroyed.
Nice.
Ultimate victory was denied in this instance, as she was able to flee before her ship was disabled. She knew her cause was lost though, and escaped with her son into the Capellan Confederation with the remnants of her once mighty army. For the first time, Alexander was now the undisputed first prince of the Crucis March and the Federated Sons, and one of his first acts was to rename the Meghlan system to Victoria. His victory was short-lived, however, as he immediately came up against opposition when he began working on the enormous task of rebuilding the devastated principalities. Many clung to the belief that he had no say outside of his own march, and this position was championed by Dmitri Rostov himself. So strong was his position on the matter that he was prepared to muster his own forces to protect his right of absolute control in the Terran March. In an ill-fated move to capture a bargaining chip, Rostov dispatched a team to kidnap Cynthia Davion while she was touring the Draconis March.
Why?
Exactly what transpired is unknown, but sadly, Cynthia was killed during the attempt, and a state of civil war returned to the realm. This was the last thing anyone in the war-weary Federated Sons wanted. Rostov knew a fight was inevitable after the death of Cynthia, but few came to his aid. Rather, there were even defections among his own Vale Rangers.
Yeah,
Alexander,
I
in
bet so.
contrast,
It's like,
arrived on
why the hell are you doing this? Why are you screwing around?
Robinson with an overwhelming force of Avalon Hussars and Davion Guards. Though victory was assured, Davion did the unexpected by seeking out a one-on-one duel with Rostov. His reasons for doing so stemmed from more than just sparing the lives of the soldiers that were dying in the fighting around him. Alexander's military reputation was less than stellar, with Dmitri having taken most of the credit for the victories at Tancredi and Megalon. The First Prince knew that without a personal accomplishment during the war, he would lack support going forwards, and so arranged for the duel. Though we know of their reputations as strategic commanders, history does not record the relative prowess of the two as mech warriors. What we do know is that ultimately Alexander would defeat and kill Rostov, ending the war for good. The fight made the new First Prince a legend in the newly reformed armed forces of the Federated Sons, but there were always whispers that a Davion agent had sabotaged Dimitri's mech before the confrontation. The Federated Sons underwent significant restructuring in the aftermath of the Civil War, as well as transitioning the old FPF into the new AFFS, over which Alexander appointed himself as First Marshal. He also completely reformed the old principalities into 3 larger regions, but the Draconis and Capellan marches and their rulers clearly defined as being subservient to the Crucis March and the First Prince. Never again would the realm be so divided.
Okay, good.
At war's end in 2540, the United Hindu Collective peacefully joined the Federated Sons as a semi-autonomous region. The last gasp of the Civil War came in 2565 when Cassandra and David Varney's son Roger
No, he cheated. He definitely cheated.
crossed the border and began rallying support on Carmax. As he moved towards New Syrtis, he was intercepted on Kigamboni by the 8th Syrtis Fusiliers, and the rebellion was swiftly curtailed. So ended the bloodiest chapter in the Age of War.
Ugh. Birth
As
of the
the
Star.
Third Andurien War drew to a close, Ian Cameron of the Terran hegemony invited the leaders of the 2 combatant nations, the Compelling Confederation and Free Worlds League, to a peace conference on Terra. There, the 3 leaders met to hammer out the terms of the ceasefire, and hopefully put an end to the Andurien dispute once and for all. This must have given Albert Marek a sense of deja vu, as it was only 25 years earlier that he had met with Terence Liao's predecessor Calvin on New Delos to conclude the Second Andurien War. On both occasions, Albert, as the head of the Free Worlds League military, had soundly beaten the Liao aggressor, and now sat in the driving seat during the negotiations. However, this time something was different. It was during the New Delos conference that Albert had first met Ian, who was part of the Terran hegemony attaché for his mother and then Director General Deborah Cameron. During that meeting, Ian had first shared his desire to see an end to the Age of War, and wish for all of humanity.
Mad Mergen, thank you. Side note, citizens of the United Hindu Collective are exempt from combat arms branch of the Federated Sons Armed Forces, but dominate the medical corps. Nice!
To be united. The idea impressed upon the Captain General, and in the ensuing years, the 2 rulers would establish a strong personal friendship. During their correspondence, the question of how to unite the disparate nations was raised. The Third Andurien War, though undesired by Albert Marek, presented just such an opportunity. In the aftermath, Terence Liao was forced to agree to heavy reparations that might threaten to collapse the already shaky Capellan economy. However, Albert then made a proposal that would have been unthinkable to anyone else involved in the war. He agreed to cede ownership of the contested worlds to the Confederation. Terence Liao's whole impetus for beginning the war was to win personal acclaim at home, and now, quite unexpectedly, he had managed to achieve those goals. With the transfer of the Andurien systems, it was hoped that further bloodshed between the 2 nations could be avoided. It was at this point Ian Cameron raised the issue of a further alliance between the 3 powers. Terence was at first skeptical that such an ambitious diplomatic venture could succeed, but was finally won over by the promise of favoured nation status that would help bolster his economy. The Andurien Peace Treaty, signed in March of 2556, therefore included a secret sub-treaty, the Clasped Hands Agreement, that outlined their intention to continue talks on the formation of a unified tri-member state. In June of that year, the 3 leaders signed the Treaty of Geneva that would lay the foundations for the Star League.
Okay.
Many concessions and agreements were reached by this document that outlined how the economy, bureaucracy and military of this new government would function, as well as what was expected of the member states and provided in return. But one of the most significant inclusions was that House Marek would become the hereditary ruler of the Free Worlds League. Up until this point, the League was the realm that had the least ties to a specific great house, but as far as the Camerons and future Star League were concerned, the Marics were now the sole inheritor of power in that region of space. It was as well that this agreement was reached at Geneva, because upon Albert Maric's return to the Free Worlds League, he was faced with a government that was outraged that he would willingly trade away almost an entire province to a mortal enemy that millions of people had lost their lives fighting over the last 2 centuries. There was, however, little they could do to reverse his decision, as the Captain Generalcy had increased in power since its inception, and Albert had been entrusted to that position by Parliament. Meanwhile, Ian Cameron continued to act as galactic conciliator on the various disputed worlds across the Inner Sphere. This resulted in a slew of worlds that were peacefully divided between 2 nations, but from which the Terran hegemony would receive a marginal cut going forwards. Given the disputed worlds were often ones with valuable industry or resources, the cumulative total of these worlds expanded the hegemony's revenue streams considerably, and helped to offset the fact that their nation was boxed in without room for traditional expansion. Their most successful achievement came in 2558, when the troubled border between the Lyran Commonwealth and the Free Worlds League was resolved.
Yeah, okay,
House Marek
great.
had been able to yet again establish a salient deep into the Protectorate of Donegal, but this time were determined to hold on to their gains. The signing of the Tharkat Accords in 58 confirmed the Free Worlds acquisitions, but the Accords were about far more than some disputed border worlds. By now, word of the Treaty of Geneva had spread throughout the Inner Sphere, and the question on everyone's lips was, would this new alliance lead to an end to the constant wars, or lead directly into one larger than ever before? Ian Cameron was determined to see the Star League succeed, and to that end had been courting the Lyran Commonwealth for the best part of a decade, even before Terence Liao had sat down at the negotiating table. The rise of a new Archon, Trachel Steiner, provided the opportunity he'd been waiting for, as she was much more amenable to the idea than her predecessor. The hegemony and Commonwealth had been steadily increasing economic ties, which had led to a boom in the industrial might for both nations, now far outstripping any rivals. However, there was real concern that the Lyran economy would become subservient to the Star League once formed. Nevertheless, the LCAF stood to gain massively from the sharing of military technology and expertise offered by the current HAF and future Star League Defense Force. The signing of the Tharkat Accords was met with similar derision among the Lyran Estates General as was offered by the Free Worlds Parliament, but just as before, the deed was already done, and despite one abortive attempt at completely opening up the realm to outside trade going wrong, after tweaks to the controls on the Lyran economy, the Commonwealth soon found itself making enormous financial gains. This could not have been more untrue for the Federated Sons, who around this point were in deep economic trouble. The damage suffered
I would assume so, considering how much fucking war was fought in those borders.
during the Civil War had cost them dearly, and though Alexander Davion's reforms were going some of the way to getting the realm back on track, they were still in financial trouble. Unknown to most, except for Cameron and his co-conspirator Albert Marek, their poor situation had actually been exacerbated by the actions of those foreign realms, with the goal of making the new league an appealing prospect, in much the same way that they had convinced the Capellan Confederation to join. Alexander, however, was determined that if the Federated Sons were to join, it would be on their own terms. By 2567, the recovery efforts were well enough underway that Davion was prepared to accept membership as an equal party in the Star League, and on October 27th signed the New Avalon Accords, leaving the Draconis Combine as the last holdout. In the end, convincing Hihiro Kurita did not provide any great challenge. He had been agreeable to the idea since he had first heard of it, but needed a way to sell it to his people. Ian Cameron resorted to the same offer he had made Alexander. If a war between the Federated Sons and Draconis Combine ever broke out, the Terran hegemony would take up arms against the aggressor. The Treaty of Vega was signed on August 15, 2569, and secured the sixth and final great power as a member of the Star League. 2 years later, the leaders of the six-member states met on Terra to make a historic announcement. On July 9, 2571, the Lords of the Great Houses signed the Star League Accords, formally bringing the new superstate into existence. It was a pronouncement that promised to usher in a new golden age of humanity, where our species would reach its technological and societal epoch. But reality is rarely so straightforward. Immediately after signing the Accords, copies were dispatched to the four major periphery nations. Cameron's dream was to unite all of humanity after all. Over the llast 2 centuries, the Taurians and Rimwalders had been joined in 2417 by the Outworlds Alliance, an isolationist movement formed in response to the constant bloodletting exhibited by the Innisphere nations, and in 2530 by the Magistry of Canopus, a hedonistic state formed by disgruntled Marek warriors, where the pursuit of personal happiness was valued above all else.
A hedonistic state, there we go.
Each of these four periphery powers had a bad history with their Innisphere neighbours, and a strong sense of independence. it is not surprising that not one of them agreed to join the nascent Star League. But Ian Cameron had not come this far to be stopped now. Most historians date the end of the Age of War to coincide with the end of the Third Andurien conflict, but the 15 years of peace that followed were as much an epilogue to that century and a half of violence as they were a prelude to the Star League. Regardless of where you draw the line between eras, all of those years of war would barely hold a candle to what would soon follow with the Star League's first major undertaking, the commencement of the Reunification War.
And now we're here. And now we are here. It is a lot. But this is exactly what I wanted to see. I wanted to see how this would go. I wanted to see where everything came from. How we got the great houses, where they originated from, how everything wound up being this way. And after so long, I'm there now. Warpugs, I love timelines. I am going to split it up, Edge Crush. I really am. BattleTech starts in 3000. Yeah, true. Seth, you have a nice night, bud. You have a great night. So when we get to the Unification Wars next week, we're going to be splitting that up into 2 parts because it is long. But I'll tell you guys this. This is exactly what I wanted to see. Something that would explain the history in a manner that I could really just kind of grasp it and be able to see everything form up. That's important. Anytime, like, I understand how people say, learn about the mechs, learn about this, learn about that. But once I get to a certain point, I have to understand where this was founded. And to see these states just come into being slowly over time, and the political machinations that went into their formation, and eventually the wars that led to their foundation. This is exactly what I wanted to see. You're going to do some research and find out some campaigns or ideas for battles and figure out how to work the vehicles? Do what you got to do, bud. This is just exactly what I wanted to get into. Now, as far as other mechs, things of that nature, I might. Are there still undiscovered pockets of humanity in BattleTech? There probably are, dude. There probably are. Very much so. If you looked at that early map that early map, entire areas were not even considered governments. They were colonies, but they weren't even governments. So essentially what it boils down to is the Federated Sons' Davion Civil War was nothing more than the War of the Roses. The Kuritas have a bad habit of horses and getting themselves killed. The Steiners were no one to be messed with. And the Capellans are the Capellans. But the big holdout from this, for me, was the Free Worlds League. I was actually kind of surprised by some of the elements of the Free Worlds League. And how that one in itself was... Well, how House Merrick came to be, I didn't think, like, I had thought that the entire thing would have been like a feudal house system far before then, but I didn't realize that House Merrick had taken power so recently to the formation of the Star League. That was kind of interesting. So literally, if they were all to meet the Star League, yeah. Okay, so I'm about to get up here, Warpugs. I've been sitting here for a little while. Gonna get up, move around a bit. Next week we'll start on the reunification wars, which we all know the Baron. We know what happens to them. We know that they win, but my God, did they get embarrassed in the process. Warpugs, thank you for joining me. Thank you for spending some time with me tonight. I'm going to head out from here. I hope you guys have a great night, and I will catch you guys next time. Thank you all for joining me. This is a blast for me to be able to sit down and just enjoy this with you all. 20-year-long mess, no doubt. I'll catch you guys when we get to it. Next week, BattleTech Tuesday, we're off again.